Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Richard Wolff's Understanding Socialism. This is from the introduction. Socialism is a kind of yearning for a better life than what capitalism permits for most people. Socialist yearnings are as old as capitalism itself because they are its products. Where and when capitalism's problems and failings have accumulated criticism and critics, socialist voices have arisen. And so it is again now. Any serious discussion of socialism must begin by acknowledging socialism's rich diversity. Whatever particular aspect of socialism we choose to analyze, they need to be located within socialism's complexity. That avoids presenting one's own interpretation as if it were the entirety of socialism. In this book, I focus on the economic aspects of socialism, how it differs from capitalism in broad outlines. I'm more interested in socialist critiques of capitalism and their implications about socialist alternatives than in the particulars of the few early experiments in erecting socialist systems, USSR, People's Republic of China, and so on, that history so far offers. Finally, my own education and work constrain me to concentrate on Western Europe and North America. Some important aspects of socialism are thus not covered or discussed here. Yearnings for better lives, such as socialism proposes, are not new. In slave societies, the slaves hoped and dreamed of lives less hard and less out of their own control. Their yearning aimed to obtain freedom. They sought social change that would preclude any one person being the property of another. In feudal societies, the serfs, free in the sense that no one owned them, yearned for better lives too. Their subordination to lords included heavy labor and other burdens that they wanted lifted. They hoped and dreamed of a society in which they would not be bound to the land, the lord of that land, and the feudal dues of labor and subservience. The serfs mobilized in the 1789 French Revolution to demand liberty, equality, and brotherhood. In effect, the serfs had expanded on what the slaves had called freedom. In the American Revolution against British King George III, the revolutionaries were neither slaves nor serfs. They were mostly self-employed farmers, craftspeople, and merchants subject to a foreign feudal kingdom. They wanted liberty as individuals to pursue their dreams without hindrance from feudalism or monarchism, whether foreign or domestic. They added democracy to the goals advanced by the slaves and serfs before them. The different systems of slavery, feudalism, and small-scale self-employment produced masses of people yearning for better lives. Eventually, each of those systems provoked revolutions. Many people then sought to break away from and go beyond those systems. The French and American revolutions marked key moments in the social transformations of major pre-capitalist systems into capitalist ones. By capitalist system, we mean that particular organization of production in which the basic human relation is employer-employee instead of master-slave, lord-serf, or individual self-employment. The revolutionaries who wanted and built capitalism hoped and believed the transition to employer-employee relations of production would bring with them the liberty, equality, brotherhood, and democracy they had yearned for. The revolution's leaders promised to themselves and to the people they led that those goals would be achieved. But the transition to capitalist employer-employee relations that increasingly replaced the previous slave, feudal, and self-employment relations of production had unintended consequences. Capitalism soon proved to be different from what its revolutionaries had hoped. While it enabled some people to be more free and more independent than slaves, serf, or self-employed subjects of monarchies had been, it also seriously limited freedom, independence, and democracy for many. Capitalism betrayed many of the promises made by its advocates. It produced and reproduced great inequalities of income and wealth. Poverty proved to be as endemic as capitalism seemed equally adept at producing and reproducing both wealth and poverty. The capitalist rich used their wealth to shape and control politics and culture. Democratic forms hid very undemocratic content. The cyclical instability attending capitalism constantly threatened and hurt large numbers of people, and so on. Growing numbers of employees within capitalism began to yearn for better lives. They defined those yearnings first in the familiar terms of the earlier French and American revolutions: equality, fraternity, liberty, and democracy. They criticized a capitalism that failed to deliver those to most people and demanded social changes to achieve them. Many people still continue to want a better, softer, friendlier capitalism, where government regulates and intervenes to achieve more of what the French and American revolutionaries had yearned for and promised. They are also often self-defined as socialists. However, capitalism's development provoked another, different perspective that also called itself socialism. In that view, capitalism had not broken from slavery, feudalism, and monarchy nearly as much as its advocates had imagined. Slavery had master slaves, feudalism had lord serfs, and monarchy had king subjects as their key sources of their inequalities, lack of freedom, oppressions, and conflicts. The employer-employee relation of production and capitalism generated parallel problems. Capitalism installed monarchies inside individual workplaces, even as monarchies outside workplaces were rejected. Kings mostly disappeared, but inside workplaces, the owners or their designated boards of directors assumed king-like powers. The book Understanding Socialism by Richard Wolff. Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And Happy New Year! Greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. Wow, it's the second day of the new year, and there is so much going on in this year, and there is so much to talk about. And I hope you had a wonderful holiday season and, a New Year's celebration that didn't leave you with too much of a headache. But anyhow, let's dig right into it. In our program today, by the way, in our first hour, I want to talk about Chuck Todd, Meet the Press, the state of the press, what's going on with hate as a tipping point with Donald Trump, stuff like that. But then also in our second hour, Professor Richard Wolff is going to be here. The Fed is sitting on $4 trillion in money, if my recollection is correct from our notes this morning. And, has just been throwing literally hundreds of billions of dollars into the economy. How sustainable is that? And when it stops, if it stops, what happens? And if it doesn't stop, what happens? This is rather problematic. And in our third hour, Alan Grayson has written a new book about how impeachment has historically worked and how it should and could work. He's not only a former member of Congress and a progressive, but also an attorney and a scholar of this kind of stuff. His book is actually quite good, and he's going to drop by and talk with us. And we got some science stuff. We got other things to talk about. And, of course, our telephone number, 202-808-9925. Should you have thoughts on these various topics that we're talking about today. So let me just dig right into it. I want to start out with Chuck Todd. I mean, Chuck Todd has come right out and said, we're being used for propaganda. And that's a pretty amazing statement. What's most amazing to me is that it took him all these years to figure it out. I mean, that the Republicans, when they come on his program, aren't just there to say, oh, well, we believe in small government. It would be a good thing if government just got out of the way. The old Reagan rhetoric, right? Which at the time, there were those of us saying, what he's saying really is deregulate these big companies and let them throw more poison into the air so they can make more profit, even though we die of cancer. And the media didn't get that, but at least back then it was like, and we think lowering taxes will actually increase revenues. And the rest of us were going, it's never happened in history. But Chuck Todd's predecessors, David Gregory and before him, Mr. Russert and, on it goes. They were all like, okay, next question. So Chuck Todd appears to have had an epiphany, and which raises an interesting question. If Chuck Todd's realization that the Republicans come on his show, on Meet the Press on Sundays, and not just his show, obviously all the Sunday shows, because they come on and they all say essentially the same thing. And more often than not, they are either flat out lies or distortions of the truth that are functional lies. his realization that he's being used this way, what's going to come out of it? And how does this serve America having such a dysfunctional news media? I mean, do you trust the news now? Do you trust the weekend shows? Do you find yourself yelling at the TV? Or have you given up on them? And what do you think that Chuck Todd and the rest of the hosts of these Sunday shows should be doing with their guests? I mean, I've noticed that there are a few hosts, principally Joy Reid and Rachel Maddow, who will occasionally, and I mean like maybe once a month or something, very rarely, but nonetheless will occasionally have a Republican or a conservative on, and when they start lying, they will immediately say, well, that's just not true. And, and I've seen this on CNN too. Van Jones, do that a number of times. But the problem that Chuck Todd and these other guys have, and it's going to be a huge problem going into this election year, because there's objective lies and then there's kind of subjective lies, like when somebody says, well, I think Joe Biden is corrupt, for example, and really they're, what they're trying to say is that they've bought into this Republican story that Joe Biden somehow, got rid of a corrupt prosecutor in Ukraine because the guy was looking into his son, which was not true. I mean, it's just on its face not true. And yet there's 1,400 ads over on Facebook right now from the Trump campaign that say that. It's a lie. And so, these guys are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, because in their minds and in their theory of broadcast, these are what are called guest-driven shows. Not to pull the curtain back too much or get inside radio and inside television, but basically there's a couple of different kinds of shows. There's what's called host-driven shows, which is what Rush Limbaugh does. He very rarely has guests. He takes a few calls, but mostly you hear what he has to say. And that's pretty much how I run this show. The host-driven shows, are, and that's what Rachel Maddow does on television. The first half hour of her entire show, she typically doesn't have a single guest. That's a host-driven show. You build a relationship with the host. It takes a lot of work to do a host-driven show. They're the most difficult kind of shows to do, because you've got to do a hell of a lot of prep. But anyhow, there's host-driven shows. Then there are guest-driven shows, which is like the Sunday shows, where, the show only exists because of the guests. And then there are news-driven shows, which is like the news shows that you see in the morning on TV. Poppy Harlow and Jim Sciutto, or however he says his name on CNN, those kind of the news-driven shows. And then there's caller-driven shows, which is like what Ed Schultz used to do, where, all he did was just take calls all day long, 3 hours a day, 5 days a week. And, his slogan was, where America comes to talk. And I miss Ed. Ed was a good guy and a friend. He died of a heart attack, year before last, I guess now. And, he's been gone for a while. But anyhow, that was caller-driven. Those are the four kinds of basically talk radio and television that are done. And caller-driven is what you see on C-SPAN, where they take calls from listeners for an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours. So if you're running a guest-driven show like Meet the Press, and you can't get guests, you're out of business. I mean, Rachel Maddow could do her show and never have a guest. I frequently do this show without a single guest. We're going to have 2 guests today, and both of them are going to be on for 12 minutes. I mean, out of 3 hours of broadcasting. So, but if I was doing a show like Meet the Press, where all I did was interview people, it would be a flaming disaster if people would not come on the show. And that's what Chuck Todd is looking at. If he calls these Republicans on their lies, they may stop showing up for his show. And if they stop showing up for his show, and only Democrats show up because he's only willing to put on people who tell the truth, then it's going to look like his show is by and for Democrats. And he's going to start losing Republican viewers. They'll all start migrating to Fox. On the other hand, if he tries to call them on their BS, they'll just come up with new lies. So what's he to do? Well, I have a few suggestions. I posted some of them over on Facebook this morning. On our every morning I write a little paragraph around 5 o'clock in the morning, and Louise puts it up on our Facebook page for the Thom Hartmann Program. And what inspired me was a piece that Hunter wrote for the Daily Kos in which he raises these same issues and offers some of the same suggestions. He actually goes a little farther than I do on this. And so his suggestions are, number one, and my suggestion as well, number one, don't run these shows live. Why does Face the Nation, Meet the Press, why do these shows have to be live? Why can't they be recorded an hour before air? So that the word chyron is an inside television word, but it's in use so often that most people know what it is. It used to be called lower thirds, or they have been called lower thirds as well. It's called a chyron because this machine was invented back in the 50s by Mr. Chiron, I guess, that would put text on the screen. But anyhow, it would give, if the show was pre-recorded, it would give the producers or the fact checkers or the people, working on the show a chance to look it up and say, oh, Ted Cruz is lying through his teeth. And then the chyron could say, this is what Ted Cruz is saying is not true, or could actually dispute it. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is to try to balance the liar with somebody who's going to tell the truth. Now, that's pretty much what many of the shows have gone to. In other words, if they've got a Republican on, they'll have a Democrat on as well, or they'll have a panel or something like that. Or I think what Chuck Todd does is he goes to a panel afterwards. But if you're trying to balance it, then you're giving credibility to the liar by having the non-liar on there, which is kind of a tough one. You could ask serious follow-up questions. You could stop, just say, hey, wait a minute. I know that's a lie. We're going to stop right here. I'm not going to ask any more follow-up questions until we dig into this. Now, are you lying because you came on this show specifically to tell lies? Or are you lying because somebody's paying you? Or are you lying because you've been told that if you don't say these things, the president will attack you and you'll lose your next election? Why are you saying this, Senator Cruz? Why are you saying this, Senator Graham? Kellyanne Conway, why are you saying this? What's in it for you? Now, that's typically never done, because that's considered a personal attack, right? That's an ad hominem. That's basically what you're saying to the host or to the guest. And I've said this a few times to my guests, and I've learned that it typically really upsets them, number one, and number two, they don't want to come back on the show when you do it. So it's probably not the best way to do it. But boy, would it be delicious, right, if they did. So, and I get conservatives on the program all the time. In fact, we try to get conservatives on the program just so that we can provide people with a template for how to talk back to crazy Uncle Ralph at Thanksgiving dinner, or the guy in the cubicle next to you who listens to Rush Limbaugh all day long. So anyway, the state of our media and the reason why I raise this, because there's so much going on, and I'm going to get into a lot of it in just a minute, hate crimes and all kinds of other stuff. But the state of the media is such a crucial issue right now because this is an election year. And the lies are flying fast and furious right now in social media, on Facebook and Twitter in particular. And they're starting to fly, and they've been good, fast and furious on Fox News for the better part of the entire Trump presidency. But we've got to do something, or the media has to do, so they've got to clean up their act.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
I guess I'm pretty amazed that Chuck Todd even acknowledged this. Tip of my hat to him on that. Now, let's see what he's going to do with it. We'll be back. And welcome back, Robbie in Portland, Oregon. Happy New Year, Robbie.
Hey, Happy New Year, Tom.
Thanks.
You mentioned the media. I got to say, I'm turning 30 this year, which is, I guess, pretty young to maybe some of the base that is listening to this. But the news has entirely changed. I first got all wrapped up into politics when I saw George Bush lose the popular vote. He won, Florida with complete, general election fraud, I should say.
Yeah.
But that's when I got really involved. I started watching politics. I was campaigning for John Kerry. And I believe that was when I started noticing news changing, right around 2004. Yeah. 2006 is when basically the mainstream media started taking, it seemed like they were kind of following Fox's directive. You know, Fox had Sean and Hannity, which was, as you were saying, they had the left, they had the right. You know, and what they turned it into is, and now what it is.
Oh, you mean
just
Hannity and Combs? Yeah.
Oh, Hannity and Combs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Gosh,
and then Hannity got sick and tired of Combs telling the truth and got him fired, basically.
Oh, and Combs wasn't even good at it. He was just always getting steamrolled over, you know, Hannity because, you know, Hannity was a lot louder. But what I find is, you know, what we're witnessing right now is I don't trust the Democrat news either. You're very forgiving for Democrats, Tom. I am not. I look for the truth. And unfortunately, I see Rachel Maddow and I see infotainment. I see nothing but emotion-driven news telling people how to think. I don't see news. I took journalism when I was in high school, and I don't see the same practices being practiced anymore on our national level. But I wanted to bring up.
I would not disagree with that with a lot of shows. And I realize that there are some areas that Rachel just never touches upon, and things like net neutrality, and I'm assuming that's because Comcast owns the network. But
hearing Rachel Maddow cry about news is just it's frustrating because I would much rather hear
I get
the
it.
news. But let me finish my point if
sure.
I could. The news right now is from a framed narrative of the controlled oligarch. If you look at who owns the media, it's all stemming from the same money. So what I see them framing the left and the right narratives, which is how they're controlling the topic. For instance, remember how everyone's talking about socialism and fascism, and they're getting all wrapped up. And I had mentioned to you, I look at socialism and capitalism as a form where you can't have one nation completely socialist without it being a communist nation, and you can't have a completely capitalist nation without it turning into a fascist nation. And so these definitions are thrown around on the networks like it's one or the other, just because some politicians are socialist, which means they just want to pass more socialist policies for the social public. Yeah. But we wrap these things in, and they turn it into the left or the right, which dumbs down the public. And I'll finish it on this point, and I'll take my answer off the air, Tom. But, for instance, we're supposed to be upset. A lot of Democrats are telling me that the Russian election interference is a big problem. But the news isn't even talking about how the Democratic Party rigged a primary nomination in 2016. If we're supposed to be upset about Trump trying to influence, and you said, the fake news on Facebook. What about all the false stuff that the mainstream news, that the TV channels are doing to Bernie Sanders?
Yeah, that falls into the category of what I'm trying to talk about here. I mean, there's been a Bernie Warren blackout going on for at least the last month or two, and arguably much longer. But your points are well taken, Robbie. We'll be back. It's 22 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. It's not rocket science, so you can check it out at thomhartmann.com. Thank you. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. A lot of other stuff going on, and in the news. And I want to just touch on a couple of points here. The first is, and this is a news story actually from earlier last year, from a few months ago, but and it's looking at 2016, 2017, and early 2018. The numbers are not in yet for the end of the year 2018, and we probably won't get them for another few months. Probably it'll be around March that we start seeing hate crime numbers. But this is truly breathtaking. This is a study that was done by a professor of political science, Regina Branton, at the University of North Texas, and an assistant professor of political science at Texas A&M University, A.L. Feinberg, and a professor of political science and director of the Latina and Mexican American Studies at the University of North Texas, Valerie Martinez Ebers. And these three universities and these three professors got together and they did this study of the rise of hate crimes during 2016-2017. And what they found was shocking. What they found was, there was an overall rise in hate crimes, 2017 over 2016, and the rise was 17% nationwide. But what is truly amazing is that in the year 2016, Donald Trump did 275 presidential campaign rallies. And what they found was that in the counties where Donald Trump did a campaign rally, hate crime went up 226% that year, in the year 2017 over 2016. Or, in the here, their language. Trump's 275 presidential campaign rallies in 2016 and increased incidents of hate crimes in subsequent months. So they went up. We found that counties that had hosted, this is from their study, we found that counties that had hosted a 2016 Trump campaign rally saw a 226% increase in reported hate crimes over comparable counties that did not host such a rally. And they note that the numbers are probably even worse. They say it's far more likely that hate crime statistics are considerably lower because of underreporting. And how do they know that it's a Trump effect? Well, in many cases, they say a considerable number of these reported hate crimes specifically reference Donald Trump. Remember the guy who sent all the pipe bombs to Democrats all over the country, including the president and vice president? He had Trump bumper stickers all over, and Trump memorabilia all over his van. And finally, I want to get into my book on voting is coming out, and I want to, and it's not out now, but it's available for pre-order. But I want to get into how the Republicans are trying to rig the 2020 election. I'll tell you that after the break, and we'll pick up your calls.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
It's the place where despair is not an option. Helping you win the water cooler wars. Thom Hartmann here with you. Years of strategy and struggle against the prison industrial complex. It's a collection of essays. This one is by David Gilbert on page 31, titled The System Within the System, the Prison Industrial Complex and Imperialism. For those of us held behind locked gates within the walls and fences topped with razor wire, the corrections regime is the system that works tirelessly to impose total control over every aspect of our lives. Yet as ponderous and powerful as prisons are, they're only one part, a central girder, of a much bigger and more foreboding house of horrors, which can most accurately be named imperialism. The structural needs of the larger edifice set the specifications for the size and position of the girder. The strength of the girder helps determine how long the building itself will stand. We can't understand the explosion of imprisonment in the United States since 1971 without looking at an imperialism's urgent needs and goals of that period. By the same token, we can't develop an effective program around the prison industrial complex without grappling with the stresses and trends of the larger system of imperial rule. To be clear, before you take time to read this chapter, I don't offer any brilliant ideas on strategy. Those will most likely emerge from the organizing and activist efforts themselves. However, some of the concerns discussed may raise questions that go into forming strategy. I definitely look forward to learning from the dialogues that this generates on these issues. Imperialism may sound like the kind of rhetoric we want to avoid, but it's one word that needs to be rescued as the best way to name the system that rules over us. The basis of imperialism is the relentless quest for profits around the globe. Its most striking characteristic is the colossal and grotesque polarization of wealth. That polarization happens between nations, between the rich countries of the North and the impoverished ones of the global South, the impoverished countries of Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia, and at the same time within each country based on class, race, and gender. The poles of dazzling wealth and abject poverty are intimately linked, as the former results from the ruthless plunder of the latter. This system is built on and intensifies all the major forms of oppression: patriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy, all of which are structurally central. At the same time, imperialism highlights the global character of the system in a way that explains why the most intense oppression and resistance have been in the South, and that also provides the context for why the liberation struggles of the various people of color have been in the forefront within the U.S. There's no way to capture what the system costs in human life and potential, the pain and loss for all of us. Close to 1 billion human beings suffer chronic hunger, while another 2 billion face nutritional deficiencies. 1 billion lack access to clean drinking water. Just looking at children under the age of 5, imperialism is a holocaust in progress. Over 9 million die every year from easily preventable causes associated with poverty. The price for future generations may be even more severe as the rapaciousness of this global frenzy for profits threatens the very ecological basis for sustaining human life on any scale on our planet. Since most people won't accept living in squalor amid plenty, imperialism entails both the most sophisticated and the most brutal forms of social control. Its most salient feature is war, war after war after war, mainly against the peoples of the South. The domestic front line of such repression is a truly violent and harmful prison industrial complex. Today, 2,300,000 people are held behind bars, about 7 times the number in 1971. That explosion was unprecedented, coming after a 70-year period when the rates of imprisonment had remained more or less constant. This dramatic change did not result from some sudden skyrocketing of criminal activity, but rather from a radical expansion of what was designated as a crime and a draconian increase in the punishments for those crimes. Such extreme measures were driven by considerations way beyond criminal justice and often at cross purposes to the proclaimed goal of public safety. These destructive changes were born from crisis, one much more severe and protracted than the periodic ups and downs of the business cycles that occur over a roughly 10-year period, but rather a situation that threatened the very survival of the system. Such structural crises occur because capitalism is by its nature unstable. The economy is vast and complicated, but the major decisions are made by a tiny corporate and financial elite, with each thinking only of his own profits. When a structural crisis develops, the long-term institutional arrangements that assured a reliable flow of profits and the rule of capital no longer function. One dramatic example was the Great Depression of the 1930s, followed by World War II. At the end of that period, a new set of international institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, were created. At the same time, a new deal was hammered out for the terms of the bargain between capital and labor within the U.S. Those arrangements worked well for capital until they broke down a generation later. That new structural crisis, which emerged between 1968 and 73, is the seedbed for the burgeoning of the prison industrial complex and many related changes in U.S. history. The first and most obvious signs were political, as the resistance to imperialism crested in 1968. Abolition now.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, 34 minutes past the hour. And last week I got my advanced copies of The Hidden History of the War on Voting. I had argued that the title should be The Republican War on Voting because there is no Democratic war on voting, but my publisher wanted it to be a little less partisan. So, although most of the book is just like, it's insanely infuriating, and you know, it documents the Republican war on voting. that's been going on largely since the Nixon administration, but really went on steroids in 2000 with the George W. Bush campaign. And then after 2002, I think it was, the Help America Vote Act, which mandated that states keep their lists clean, their voter rolls. And, you know, it's a problem for states, and it's not a problem. You know, like, you know, I've before we moved back here to Portland, we were in Washington, D.C. I voted in D.C. I registered to vote and voted there. Before we were in D.C., I was in Oregon. I registered to vote here. Before I was in Oregon, I was in Vermont, and I registered to vote there. Before that, it was Georgia. Before that, it was New Hampshire. Before that, it was Michigan. And every time I moved, I'd register to vote in the new state, but I never let the old state know that I was no longer there. Now, what this means is that there are states that have more registered, or there were prior to 2002, states that had more registered voters than they had citizens, because they, you know, but it wasn't a problem. I mean, it's not like, even though I was still registered to vote in D.C. and I moved to Oregon, that I was going to, you know, file an absentee ballot in D.C. I mean, people just don't do that. Nobody wants to go to jail for that, and you can go to jail for that. It just literally doesn't happen. I mean, you know, maybe once or twice a year, you know, I mean, literally 1 or 2 people a year get busted for voting in 2 states. But it's so rare. So it was a non-problem. But with the Help America Vote Act, the Republicans decided to fix this problem. And they said, you know, the states have to clean up all those people on their rolls who don't live there anymore. Why? Well, because maybe they'll try to vote there. Now, you know, I get cleaning up the rolls. Maybe if somebody hasn't voted in 15 years, you know. But somebody went to the trouble of registering to vote. And it's not a small thing. Registering to vote in many states is a very difficult thing. But with this, by being allowed to do this, with the Help America Vote Act of 2005, or 2002, whenever it was, maybe it was 2003, it was supposed to fix the problems of Florida. Remember that, hanging chads and all that? Well, we're gonna spend they allocated $5 billion to give to the states to buy voting machines from Wally Odell, Diebold, who said, I want to deliver Ohio to the Republicans in 2004. And ES&S, which was started by the Yarosevich brothers, who were end-time millennialists, not millennials, but millennialists, as in end-of-time Christian believers that these were the last days. That's who was running these 2 voting machine companies. So anyhow, but the purges, I think, are the big thing. And Wisconsin, you know, a circuit court judge said it's okay if they remove 230,000 people from their voting rolls this year. Donald Trump, remember, won that state by 23,000 votes. Georgia, Brian Kemp, now the governor, wanted to remove you'll recall, he removed over 1 million people just in the 2 years before he challenged Stacey Abrams, 2-1 in black areas. And they do it now by a process called caging, which the Republican Party was busted for doing back in the 70s and had a court order for almost 30 years preventing them from doing this. And then it got legalized with the Help America Vote Act, and the Supreme Court last year, or the year before last, 2017, ruled that Ohio, which was doing this, it was just fine. Caging is where the state, or it used to be the Republican Party, would mail you a postcard saying, you know, please mail back this card proving that you are still at this address and that you still want to be registered as a voter. Now, the cards were designed to look like junk mail. Most people just threw them away. And then, I mean, this is what William Rehnquist used to do. He would stand in line in Arizona back in the 60s, big, tall, burly guy, 6'2", huge guy, actually. He'd stand in line, and as Hispanic and Native American voters would come up, you know, he would ask them their names. He'd look at his list, and he'd say, oh, you didn't return the card. You're not, you know, and stuff like that. This is, so they got blocked from doing this. But anyhow, they're doing it again. And Georgia wanted to remove 300,000 people from the polls. And the court said, you can remove 100,000. And, you know, again, largely in black areas. Just prior to from the 2016 election until today, that was 3 years ago, until today, at least 17 million people have been removed from voting rolls nationwide. I mean, this is insane. The Voting Rights Act used to make this illegal, but not anymore. So anyhow, the Trump administration has also just declared war on Social Security. I'll get into that in the next hour. There's just so much going on here. But let's start out with Ari in Eureka, California. Hey, Ari, thanks for listening to KGOE. What's up?
Hi, Tom. You were asking what can we do about the media and what's wrong with the media. And
Yeah.
I think it's two things. I think one is on the media side, they're just desperate for sound bites because we all have the attention span of a gnat.
Yeah.
And then on the audience side, no one's learned critical thinking anymore. And so you just hear a statement and you accept it. And it's even worse now that we live in a world of alternative truths and alternative facts.
Yeah.
People can just go on television and say freaking anything.
So what do we do about it?
Well, elect the right people.
I think that's a great start. I really think that the media needs to start policing itself. Truth actually has to become a value once again. Back before before Reagan did away with the Fairness Doctrine in 1987, there wasn't a specific requirement in the law that said that the news had to tell the truth, but it did say that the news had to, what was the exact phrase? Support the public. No, it was called broadcasting in the public interest. That was the phrase.
Well,
that was
yeah,
from the Telecommunications Act of 1934.
But now that the news is part of the entertainment divisions of all these companies,
That's right.
and all these companies are like giant mega corporations, they're never going to act in our best interest. Never.
Well, I think they may if we stop tuning in. I mean, I pretty much, in the last year or so, I pretty much stopped watching the Sunday shows altogether because I just can't deal with all the Republican lies and you know, that are not challenged, that go unchallenged. And if their numbers start really crashing, and it's not like I'm trying to lead a boycott here, but I just, you know, I can't imagine, I can't believe that I'm the only person, the only consumer of these programs who has decided that they're just so pathetic that I no longer want to watch them. So, you know, maybe that'll do it. I don't know. We'll see. All right, I got to move along, but thank you for the call. It was a thoughtful, insightful comment. Johnny in Galveston, Texas. Hey, Johnny, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, can you hear me? I didn't hear the sound.
Yeah, you're on the air, Johnny. You got a little bit of static on your line, but otherwise it sounds fine. What's up?
Okay, well, happy holidays belated to you and your loved ones, and a hopeful new year for everybody.
Thank you. Back at you.
I got to push back a little bit on this idea about Chuck Todd finally seeing the light in regards to how Donald Trump and the Republicans, by implication, have been given supreme coverage, slanted coverage, to the point of manipulation of the American consumer, media consumer. It kind of makes me think of Alan Greenspan, I think it was, who made a pseudo-apology and epiphany in front of Congress back in the day about trickle-down economics. You remember that?
Yes, and David Stockman did the same thing. But Greenspan's was particularly difficult, but you know, because he had been in favor of deregulating the banks in '99 and you know, doing away with Glass-Steagall, and that was, you know, arguably the thing that led to it. Although I think his apology was after the maybe it was after the S&L collapse, and they brought in Bill Seidman to put them back together. In any case, yeah, I get what you're saying.
Retired, by the way, which is really convenient. I see that all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell
anyway,
the truth
my
after
contention is, can you hear me?
Yeah.
My contention is that Chuck Todd, just like some of the people over at Fox, they see the writing on the wall. They've made their money for the corporations, and now it's okay, it's safe to take their positions more hostile towards Donald Trump and even some Republicans. Even Rush Limbaugh, back in 1992, he, quote-unquote, regrettably endorsed Bill Clinton. You remember that?
No, I don't.
Yeah, go back and look for it. It's amazing. I was laughing because I could see his audience getting mad at him and you know, throwing a hissy.
Well, you know, the 92 election of Bill Clinton was what made Rush Limbaugh's show. I mean, so, you know, I can't, you know, but it's hard to imagine anybody would be that crazy.
And my suggestion, want to hear it, I think we should reinstitutionalize or institutionalize the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in the Constitution, right up there with the Postal Service, and provide permanent funding where it can't be touched, That way they can reinvigorate NPR and get those right-wingers out of there.
Well, NPR is doing really well. As radio, NPR basically dominates the radio landscape, which is pretty impressive. And that's, of course, why the right-wing billionaires are donating to NPR and the right-wing think tanks are showing up on NPR. And now I'm starting to hear these lies on NPR. And even, I remember when Cory Gardner was running for the Senate, and he had been one of these, fundamentalist anti-abortion guys who and Mara Eliason went on, who's, their head political person, and, clearly has Republican leanings, and went on and said, no, he's not like that at all, the week before the election. It just made me crazy. I talked about it on the air for a half a week because it made me crazy. But their television side is struggling, and I think it's because television is a very active medium, and you have to have good production values, and you have to have really, really solidly interesting programming. I think Amy Goodman does a really good job of that. Johnny, thank you for the call. Her program is it's really hard not to watch. I mean, it's just like there's just like one shocking thing after another. I view Amy Goodman, who's on Free Speech TV, by the way, at freespeech.org. I view Amy Goodman as the Walter Cronkite of our era.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archive.
And she does not suffer fools gladly either. Anyhow, we'll be back with more of your thoughts and the news of the day right after this. And welcome back. Chuck in Redondo Beach, California. Hey, Chuck, what's on your mind here?
Oh, yeah. I just had another data point for you for the media blackout of Bernie.
Okay.
Bernie and AOC had a rally in Venice Beach, which is about 5 miles north of here, and even the local news never even mentioned it. They had 15,000 people. I don't know how they get that many in Venice Beach.
Whoa.
And
I've been to Venice Beach. Venice Beach probably doesn't have 15,000 people.
Yeah, they had some place there. I don't know. They must have on the street.
Yeah.
I had a friend who went and said it was crowded, and neither one of us heard anything on the local media.
Yeah, 15,000 people with a member of Congress and a United States Senator running for president. And yet, if a Tea Party group with 300 people showed up, in a Koch brothers-driven bus, it was on the evening news.
Yeah, and this is a nice liberal Southern California, too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Amazing.
There you go. Okay, Chuck, thanks a lot for sharing that with us. Paul in St. Louis, Missouri. Hey, Paul, what's up?
Hey, Tom. Love your show.
Thank you.
I was just thinking that if Chuck Todd was going to have a problem with Republicans being exposed, or he got boycotted for exposing them to the truth, why couldn't they just take excerpts from Fox News and take those interviews and discuss them with a round table or something? And the other thing too is
that's a possibility. An alternative, Paul, would be to have retired Republicans on, which is by and large what what's her name, the woman who ran the part of the McCain campaign. She was
right.
Sarah Palin's handler. She's got a show on MSNBC in the afternoon. And, she has David Jolly and all these, Bill Kristol, these no Trump. She's a Republican. She gets the anti-Trump Republicans on. It's going to be interesting to see how those kind of shows go, when Trump is out of office. But anyhow, back to you, Paul.
Well, I think, too, that they could expose the interviewers on Fox for who they are. I mean, like Sean Hannity is not a journalist major. He's was a house painter and a college dropout. Right. So he's basically an infotainer,
Right. Now he's got a multi-million-dollar real estate empire.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, these guys are paid millions of dollars by, wealthy people and, so they're just millionaires working for billionaires.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and that's something that is worth keeping in mind. Paul, thanks a lot for the call. Morris in Long Beach. Hey, Morris, I owe you an apology. A couple of weeks ago, you called in, and I had earlier I'd put a note next to your name that you had called earlier, which was from the previous week, And our call screener caught that and told you that you couldn't get on because you'd called earlier and it was wrong for the week. I apologize. But that said, we only have a half a minute. What's on your mind? I apologize for that too, Morris.
You're a good man. No one's got the kind of character you got on the airwaves anyway. I just want to let everybody know that there's a difference between journalism and commercialism. And commercialism is going to win out all the time. And if Chuck Todd don't want to wind up like Phil Donahue, he better read what's on that Proctor, okay? And remember what Les Moonves said. It's not good for the country, but it's good for their shareholders.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you. In a half a minute, summarizing that so succinctly. Great to hear from you, Morris, and thanks for listening to KPFK. We'll be right back. It's 10 minutes before the hour. And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Teresa in New York City listening on Sirius XM. Hey, Teresa, what's up?
Hi, Thom Hartmann.
Hi, Teresa.
I like the show. I've been listening for a little while. And you know how Trump makes the helicopters whirl while the media is asking him questions?
Yeah.
So he can't answer them.
Well, it's partly so he can pretend that he didn't hear them, and partly so that you can't hear the reporter's actual questions if they challenge him.
But the media, they're not holding these people accountable for answering questions. They just let them. I mean, it almost feels cancerous, like it's causing cancer listening to them, Tom. Yeah. I just stopped listening. I'm looking for news.
Yeah, it is become poisonous, and Trump and the Republicans have become masters at using this. Solution ideas, Teresa?
Solution, yes. Let our journalists have belly laughs, laugh at them hysterically.
Oh,
and then,
that would upset them.
Just state the facts. Wouldn't that upset them?
Yeah.
I know how to upset people, Tom.
I think that being ridiculed is probably the one thing that you can do with Donald Trump that really gets him at his core.
Thank you.
So.
Hit back, punch back. We don't punch back. We don't stick together. If we stuck together, none of this would happen, Tom.
Yeah, I'm with you.
They use racism as an excuse.
Or they use it as a weapon.
No problem of who I am. I'm very proud of who I am. I'm an African-American person, and I'm proud of it.
Good on you.
I wish I was darker, Tom. And it's just, we should punch back. We should, I'm telling you, if the journalists, that would make some good television for me.
Yeah, I would love to see one of these people just start hysterically laughing at Trump, while he's doing his helicopter thing. Teresa, I got to move along, but thank you for the call. Thanks for listening to us. Margie in Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin, also listening on Sirius XM. Hey, Margie, what's up?
Hey, Tom, I have a big favor to ask of you.
What's that?
Every time you discuss Wisconsin's voter purge, please include the rest of the information that Wisconsin has same-day voter registration.
One of the few states to still have it, yes.
They're hoping that people hear about the voter purge and don't remember that you can register the same day to vote. You're playing right into their hands by not including that information.
Okay, I will be more careful in the future, Margie, and thank you very much for pointing that out. Paul, also in Wisconsin. Hey, Paul in Spooner, Wisconsin. What's up?
Margie is correct, but most of the people that are being purged aren't aware that they were purged in the first place and are not going to show up with the information they need for the same-day registration. They may not have their proper ID with at the time to register. But I've been a little proactive here. What I've done is I'm the chair of the county Democratic Party of my county, and what I've done is I reached out to the elections board, and I've done an open public records request asking for the names of each individual in the state of Wisconsin that is going to be purged. And I've asked for it in the electronic format. And what we're planning on doing is, I know DPW in Wisconsin has already filed a lawsuit against it to stop it, but I'm not going to wait for them to do anything. What we're going to do is we're going to start knocking on doors, and we're going to let those people know. By the way, you're on the list to be purged. Are you aware of that?
Wow.
And now you can go down to your clerk's office and re-register to make sure that you are on the list for elections day. Right. Because they're counting on, number one, the people that are purged don't even know they've been purged. Number two, they're going to show up to vote. They're going to find out they don't have the information. They're not on the list any longer. They have to go through the whole process of re-registering.
Right, which, by the way, slows down the line dramatically, which is exactly what, you know, in the United States right now, African Americans stand in line 200% longer than white people. Hispanics stand in line 150% longer than white people. And particularly in those areas that are heavily Democratic and heavily African American, like Milwaukee, you're going to see, if people have to register to vote when they show up, you're going to see those lines slow to a crawl.
They're going to get frustrated and walk away and not come back.
That's the point.
I'm also making a note that our last governor, Evers, who just was elected, he won by only 30,000 votes.
Right.
Now, if the Republican Party can get rid of that many people, you know that. No, but there's a problem. There's another flaw here, though. The flaw in our system is the fact that a person can move from town A to town B, re-register to vote in town B. They never notified town A that they moved, and they should have been purged. And in that case, they should have been purged.
Right.
Or people die. People die, legitimately die. They didn't notify them.
Well, that's why I said if somebody hasn't voted in 15 years, take their name off the list. I don't have a problem with that. But this thing of, you know, you didn't vote in the last election, we're going to take your name off the list. Well, he didn't like the candidate? I mean, you know, come on.
Well, we need the names. We need to notify those people, and the legitimate people that have been taken off need to be notified.
Yeah.
That we're going to go. You need to go down there and vote, and we need to help you to make sure. But if they're going to prevent us from those names, that's a whole new problem, also.
Yeah, I'm with you, Paul. I got to move along, but thank you for the call, and good on you for being the chair of your county party. That's wonderful. Mike in Lomita, California. Mike, we have just a minute left. What's up?
Hey, Tom, you wondered aloud whether the Chiron, the device that shows the text at the bottom of the TV screen, was named from Mr. Chiron.
Right.
You were right.
Aha!
Chiron was the wisest of the centaurs, the half-human, half-horse characters in Greek mythology.
That's
and his name comes from
Chiron, or I thought that was Chimera.
No, Chi and Rho. You're talking about a different mythological creature.
Oh, okay.
Chi and Rho, the first two letters of the Greek alphabet, the symbols of Christ in the sacramental churches that you see in the iconography.
Right.
And Cairo is a root that relates to handwriting. So that's where the name came from.
So Chyron, which is how they pronounce it, I believe, is actually, the thing was named after a mythological creature or after the merger?
Well,
is it supposed to be like the merger of text and picture, and therefore it's a Chiron?
Well, no, it's just the first two letters. It's like ABCs. And it's a universal symbol throughout the ancient world, and it's why you find it in all the sacramental churches still today as symbols of Christ.
Thank you, Mike.
First two letters of the alphabet. Sure.
Got it. I'm telling you, I am so blessed. I am sitting here every day with the smartest people on the planet. It's like we've got such cool listeners for this show. Anyhow, in our second hour, Professor Richard Wolff is going to drop by. We're going to be talking about the Fed stimulus plan and whether it's going to crash the economy. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Richard Wolff's Understanding Socialism. This is from the introduction. Socialism is a kind of yearning for a better life than what capitalism permits for most people. Socialist yearnings are as old as capitalism itself because they are its products. Where and when capitalism's problems and failings have accumulated criticism and critics, socialist voices have arisen. And so it is again now. Any serious discussion of socialism must begin by acknowledging socialism's rich diversity. Whatever particular aspect of socialism we choose to analyze, they need to be located within socialism's complexity. That avoids presenting one's own interpretation as if it were the entirety of socialism. In this book, I focus on the economic aspects of socialism, how it differs from capitalism in broad outlines. I'm more interested in socialist critiques of capitalism and their implications about socialist alternatives than in the particulars of the few early experiments in erecting socialist systems, USSR, People's Republic of China, and so on, that history so far offers. Finally, my own education and work constrain me to concentrate on Western Europe and North America. Some important aspects of socialism are thus not covered or discussed here. Yearnings for better lives, such as socialism proposes, are not new. In slave societies, the slaves hoped and dreamed of lives less hard and less out of their own control. Their yearning aimed to obtain freedom. They sought social change that would preclude any one person being the property of another. In feudal societies, the serfs, free in the sense that no one owned them, yearned for better lives too. Their subordination to lords included heavy labor and other burdens that they wanted lifted. They hoped and dreamed of a society in which they would not be bound to the land, the lord of that land, and the feudal dues of labor and subservience. The serfs mobilized in the 1789 French Revolution to demand liberty, equality, and brotherhood. In effect, the serfs had expanded on what the slaves had called freedom. In the American Revolution against British King George III, the revolutionaries were neither slaves nor serfs. They were mostly self-employed farmers, craftspeople, and merchants subject to a foreign feudal kingdom. They wanted liberty as individuals to pursue their dreams without hindrance from feudalism or monarchism, whether foreign or domestic. They added democracy to the goals advanced by the slaves and serfs before them. The different systems of slavery, feudalism, and small-scale self-employment produced masses of people yearning for better lives. Eventually, each of those systems provoked revolutions. Many people then sought to break away from and go beyond those systems. The French and American revolutions marked key moments in the social transformations of major pre-capitalist systems into capitalist ones. By capitalist system, we mean that particular organization of production in which the basic human relation is employer-employee instead of master-slave, lord-serf, or individual self-employment. The revolutionaries who wanted and built capitalism hoped and believed the transition to employer-employee relations of production would bring with them the liberty, equality, brotherhood, and democracy they had yearned for. The revolution's leaders promised to themselves and to the people they led that those goals would be achieved. But the transition to capitalist employer-employee relations that increasingly replaced the previous slave, feudal, and self-employment relations of production had unintended consequences. Capitalism soon proved to be different from what its revolutionaries had hoped. While it enabled some people to be more free and more independent than slaves, serf, or self-employed subjects of monarchies had been, it also seriously limited freedom, independence, and democracy for many. Capitalism betrayed many of the promises made by its advocates. It produced and reproduced great inequalities of income and wealth. Poverty proved to be as endemic as capitalism seemed equally adept at producing and reproducing both wealth and poverty. The capitalist rich used their wealth to shape and control politics and culture. Democratic forms hid very undemocratic content. The cyclical instability attending capitalism constantly threatened and hurt large numbers of people, and so on. Growing numbers of employees within capitalism began to yearn for better lives. They defined those yearnings first in the familiar terms of the earlier French and American revolutions: equality, fraternity, liberty, and democracy. They criticized a capitalism that failed to deliver those to most people and demanded social changes to achieve them. Many people still continue to want a better, softer, friendlier capitalism, where government regulates and intervenes to achieve more of what the French and American revolutionaries had yearned for and promised. They are also often self-defined as socialists. However, capitalism's development provoked another, different perspective that also called itself socialism. In that view, capitalism had not broken from slavery, feudalism, and monarchy nearly as much as its advocates had imagined. Slavery had masters slaves, feudalism had lords serfs, and monarchy had king subjects as their key sources of their inequalities, lack of freedom, oppressions, and conflicts. The employer-employee relation of production and capitalism generated parallel problems. Capitalism installed monarchies inside individual workplaces, even as monarchies outside workplaces were rejected. Kings mostly disappeared, but inside workplaces, the owners or their designated boards of directors assumed king-like powers. The book Understanding Socialism by Richard Wolff. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Inside workplaces, the owners or their designated boards of directors assumed king-like powers. The book Understanding Socialism by Richard Wolff.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome back. On the line with us is our old buddy, Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, co-founder of Democracy at Work, author of numerous books, including his most recent Understanding Marxism, which we just added to our lineup of Thom Hartmann Book Club summaries or teases or tastes or samples or whatever you want to call it, which will be up on YouTube in a day or so as well. And Professor Wolff, welcome back.
Thank you very much. It is flattering that you were reading from my work. I'm much obliged.
Oh, it's a damn good book. I wanted to talk to you about the Fed, and I believe that Sean shared this Axios Markets newsletter with you that I got this morning. Yep. Where they're going through, and Dean, I'm not sure how he pronounces his name, Raboin or whatever, who does the newsletter, goes through and points out that basically the Fed has been just pouring cash into the markets, and what we find increasingly is that prior to the Trump era, everybody thought that there was no connection or no explicit connection between Fed activity and stock markets. Although the fact that LBJ lifted Fed Chair Miller up against the wall by his throat and took it on his tippy toes and yelled at him for raising interest rates just before an election, I guess indicates that it's been a long-held secret. But, the average person didn't realize that the Fed actually could swing markets and thus get presidents elected or not reelected. But the Fed has been just pumping cash. I mean, their total assets of the Federal Reserve right now are at $4.16 trillion. Our GDP is only $20 trillion a year. What does that mean? And where does that money come from? And what happens if the Fed stops this stimulus? And why is this even happening?
Well, that's the key question. So let's start at the end. Why is it happening? In 2008, we had the second worst crash in capitalism's history. That has to be the starting point, literally, for all of these analyses. It was bested, or worsted is the better word, only by the Great Depression from 1929 to 1941. This was a collapse, and it was global, of capitalism as a system. It freaked out all of the leaders of capitalist countries. Those last 4 months, September, October, November, December of 2008, were times of all-night meetings at the Federal Reserve in Washington and New York City, in which a desperate group of bankers and their associates tried to figure out how to prevent a full-scale collapse of the American economy. And by a collapse, I don't mean something you read about in the newspaper, but something you notice when there's no milk on the shelf in the supermarket, when there is no way to get your telephone to work, and all the other signs of social collapse. And one of the things that was decided at that time was that unless things were done in an extreme way, there'd be no tomorrow for the debate about what we should have done. You simply have to try everything. So here's one of the things we did. We gave to the Federal Reserve a basic direction. They would have taken it even if we hadn't. But as a nation, the president, Bush at the time, then Obama, they were no different on this stuff. They told the Federal Reserve, do what has to be done. Print money like you never did before. Create bank accounts for all the banks. Simply put numbers into the account and allow the bank to act as if that were its own money to make loans, whether it be to corporations, to governments, to households. It didn't matter. Flood the economy with purchasing power in the hope that by doing all of that, you could stimulate, that's the word they used, a stimulus program to get the economy going again. And what has happened in the decades since has been that we have become an economy utterly dependent, sort of like life support for a very ill person, on this continuous infusion of costless, low-interest, tons of money. The Federal Reserve buys securities in the market. That's what it calls when it accumulates assets on its balance sheet and so on, in order to juice the economy, because if you leave capitalism to itself, not only do you get the crash of 2008, but they have now determined it is simply too dangerous to take the patient off. For a short time, this is my last point, for a short time, in the last 2 or 3 months of 2018, they decided they had pumped so much money in, they had to pull some out. They did that, and the stock market took a dive.
Right. In fact, so much so that for the entire year, the investors lost money no matter what they invested in.
That's right. And President Trump got freaked because he could see that if he lost the business community that he had won over with his tax cut in December 2017 by a bad stock market, he could kiss his reelection goodbye. So he went to work on Mr. Powell, got the Federal Reserve not only not to raise interest rates, but over this last year to lower them, not to end what they called quantitative easing, buying shares. Mm-hmm. They reversed it and started buying again instead of selling. So you had the resumption during 2019 of the life support infusion of endless money, and so the stock market did well in 2019, and Mr. Trump feels confident that between his base in the evangelical communities and elsewhere, and the big business money, he can have at least a reasonable shot at re-election. It's a sad story because the history of capitalism, if it teaches nothing else, teaches us that the longer you delay the inevitable 4 to 7 year cycle of downturns, the worse the cycle will eventually be. It's a little bit like not going to the doctor when you have a minor problem to discover that by waiting, you now have a big problem. So that's what we're facing.
So back in 1932, the Fed had pretty much, after the crash of October 1929, the Fed didn't do a great deal for a couple of years, and the economy just went to hell in a handbasket. And the week that FDR was sworn in March of 33, the last of the banks in America closed. I mean, that was that complete collapse that you're talking about. He got us out of that, by and large, correct me if I'm wrong on this, by saying we're going to borrow a bunch of money, and we're going to spend it putting people back to work. Because the way to get an economy working again is to put money in the pockets of people who will spend it, and that spending of wages will create demand in the marketplace, which will cause businesses to reopen to meet that demand. And that created kind of a virtuous cycle that, and then, went into World War II, which was the ultimate government stimulus, that brought us 40, 50 years of relative prosperity. On the other hand, the Bush administration, when they were faced with a crash, said, we don't want to do what FDR did. That's what Democrats do. So we're going to use fiscal policy, or monetary policy instead of fiscal policy. We're going to use the Fed instead of the marketplace. Is that a reasonable description of the difference between these two approaches?
Absolutely. It's a question of how you divide your effort to save capitalism between monetary policy, which is what the banks and the rich people want, and they're hoping, which has been what happened, that money flows into the stock market, which is what the top 5% of our people count on in terms of wealth anyway. Fiscal policy helps the mass of people, not those at the top, in that disproportionate way.
And FDR's stimulus, by pouring all that money in, and then Eisenhower continued it with the Interstate Highway Program, and Kennedy, put a man on the moon. All of those programs produced long-term prosperity, and I think you could argue that setting us up for another great crash was probably mostly in 1999 blowing up Glass-Steagall, deregulating the banks, although there were a lot of other pieces. So you could say that if we were to use the FDR strategy, we could at least have another 70 years of prosperity. But if we use the George W. Bush strategy, the Republican strategy, they use the Fed strategy, what's the end game? How do they get out of this?
They keep having to do the same thing. They have no end game. They have what you might call a continuing money flood game.
It's like we've become junkies.
Absolutely. They're dependent on all of this, and they're now focused in the short run on getting reelected. And then, there's a French, one of the great King Louis just before the French Revolution, when asked about the unsustainable money pumping spending that they did in the days of the French Empire, he had this famous line, "Après moi le déluge," which means in English, "After me comes the storm." Mr. Trump doesn't say it because he doesn't say things directly anyway, but that's his policy. He's just doing what is necessary. He didn't grab Mr. Powell by the lapels, but he did so figuratively. He got what he wanted. He got lower interest rates. You flood the economy. You boom the stock market. Not much else but the stock market. And that'll get you through the next election. That's the perspective that they have. Meanwhile, and let me stress this, when you have a decade of the sort we've just had, with interest rates at or below zero much of the time, you have created a fantastic incentive for governments to borrow, for corporations to borrow, and for households who can't borrow much more because they can't sustain what they already have. I note that the default rate for college loans these days is 11%, which is unsustainable. You have now created a debt overhang, an excess of debt that we've never seen economically before. If we have a downturn now, the risk that it will be very severe is quadrupled because of the levels of debt. As companies have a difficulty, they will no longer just fold themselves, but they'll take with them all of the lenders whom they have tapped for this low interest debt. It is an extremely dangerous situation, papered over by looking at the stock market or unemployment numbers as if those two statistics dwarf or erase all else.
Amazing. Professor Wolf, I so appreciate your wisdom. Thank you so much for dropping by today.
My pleasure, Tom, and thank you.
Great talking with you. Professor Wolf's most recent book, Understanding Marxism, democracyatwork.info, and rdwolf with 2fs.com are his websites, and you can tweet him at ProfWolf, ProfWolff. We'll be back with the program, with more of our program in just a moment. It's 18 minutes past the hour.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back in just a second. I want to get into some big pharma stuff, too. The news just keeps getting weirder and weirder. And welcome back. Brent in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Hey, Brent, what's on your mind today? Thanks for watching us on YouTube. What's up?
This is a perfect segue into what Mr. Wolf was talking about. I would love to see you have Francis Richard Connolly on your program. He was the screenwriter for a documentary from 2014 entitled JFK to 9/11, Everything is a Rich Man's Trick. He goes clear back to the early 1800s with the de Rothschilds and how they have created a credit-based global economy. And it's like 3.5 hours long. And the next thing you know, once you start watching it, the next thing you know, it's over. You just get lost for 3 hours.
Huh. Oh, sounds interesting. From JFK to 9/11. Okay, Brent, thanks a lot for the tip. Zach in North Hollywood, California. Hey, Zach, what's on your mind today?
Happy New Year, Tom.
Thanks.
Yes, I'd like to give the silent majority some ammunition going into this election this year.
Okay.
Using two quick memory tricks. The 3 C's and the 3 T's. The 3 C's are a reference to what happened to Bernie in 16. He got sabotaged by the C's, CNN, the DNC, and MSNBC. They had him in a little 3-inch box down on the right-hand part of the screen. They would not show his crowds of 20,000 or the fervor and the juice that he had. They didn't want that to get out. And so just remember the 3 C's.
Okay.
Now, to defang the term socialism going into this year, I have something I use at my gym. It's called the 3 T's. Anybody comes up to me and say, hey, man, why are you supporting socialism? I go, it's because of the 3 T's. You don't understand. Modern socialism is nothing more than policies that benefit all persons. And I refer to the 3 T's: toilets, trash trucks, and ptomaine. It's something that everybody can understand.
Ptomaine starts with a P, but okay, go ahead.
Yeah, well, the pronunciation is the reference.
I got it.
Yeah, you want your trash piling up around your yards and stinking up your place. That's modern socialism. Trash trucks. You want to flush your toilet, your waste away from you, nice clean environment, that's socialism. You want ptomaine when you go to get your meat at the store, that's modern socialism. Simply policies that benefit all persons. That's it.
Yeah, the 3 C's and the 3 T's. That's a good one, Zach. That's a good one. I think that, I was reading Richard Wolff's book on socialism over the weekend, or actually it was this morning I was reading it, Understanding Socialism, his newest book. And he makes the point that there's this spectrum of socialism. On one end, you've got, really simple stuff like Social Security. On the other end, you've got, the Soviet Union. And that most of the countries of the world that actually consider themselves socialist, which would be, the European and Northern European countries in particular, are really in the middle of that spectrum. They're practicing socialism hand in hand with regulated capitalism. And it seems like a reasonable, step for me.
Yeah,
Zach, thanks.
Just blend.
Thanks for the C's and the T's. That's fascinating. Appreciate the call, and thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. I'm going to get to the story about Big Pharma here right after the break at the bottom of the hour, because it's a fairly substantial story, and I want to have some elbow room. There are a few other things, though, that I wanted to share with you and that we can talk about. The Trump administration has apparently, well, not apparently, they just did it, or it's a proposal. They're proposing to basically gut Social Security. This is step one toward privatizing Social Security, which has been the Republicans' dream ever since it was over their loud objections in 1935, as I recall, passed. And the way that Trump is proposing to do this, and by the way, this isn't the first time this has been tried. Reagan tried this in the early 1980s. He tried the exact same thing. And I'll tell you what came about as a result of that. But anyhow, what the proposal is it's not specifically for people who are on Social Security retirement. There's a different word for it, Social Security income or something like that. It's not for the people who are just getting regular Social Security payments. This is targeting people who are on Social Security disability or who are getting supplemental security income. And so these are folks who qualify for Social Security who are not just getting it because they're over 65 and retired. And he's selling this, since these two programs represent somewhere between a quarter and a third of all the payments that Social Security makes. He's selling this as a way of strengthening the Social Security retirement system, which seems like an upside, but the downside is that people will die. And what they're saying is right now it takes, because they have laid off so many people who work for the Social Security Administration, starting with the Reagan administration. Reagan was the one who started this process, and it's happened in every single Republican administration. It's been reversed during 2 of the Democratic administrations, but it just keeps on rolling, is cut funding for Social Security so they have fewer employees. So right now, if you apply for Social Security disability, say you're 40 years old, you fall and break your neck, and you're paralyzed for the rest of your life, like my friend Michael Hutchison, and you apply for Social Security disability, it takes 2 years for your application to be processed. Well, what they're proposing is that every 6 months you have to reapply. Now, just imagine what kind of a nightmare that's going to be. Reagan did this back in the early 2000s, and according to a piece over in Salon magazine, Reagan was, I'm quoting from this, Reagan was forced to reverse his attack on Social Security after massive public outcry and bipartisan condemnation from Congress, but not before 21,176 people died, including several who died by suicide because their benefits had been cut off. So Trump is proposing a plan that's going to gut Social Security disability and Social Security supplemental security income, SSDI and SSI, and require everybody every 6 months to go through this rigorous reapproval process that can right now take up to 2 years. And Trump has laid this out as an executive order that they begin this process. Now it's a proposal right now, but it hasn't been put into place. And the only thing that can stop it from being put into place is Congress. Congress could pass a law saying Donald Trump can't do this. So you might want to consider calling 202-225-3121, 202-225-3121, which is the switchboard for Congress, and ask for your 2 senators and your 1 House member and raise the issue. We'll be back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Side of the break, Big Pharma is poisoning your drugs. The government seems fine with it. We'll get into that, and I'll pick up your calls. Stick around. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment by yours truly. This is from Chapter 1, The Unholy Alliance of Racism, Genocide, and Guns. In Isaiah 14:21, the Lord tells Isaiah, "Prepare for his sons a place of slaughter because of the iniquity of their fathers." It's a variation on the old story of karma and seems in a very real way to be playing out today in the United States. America is facing an epidemic. Public health officials use that word of gun-related suicides, accidents, and even homicides and police killings. That epidemic has grown worse in the past decade, largely because the number of guns in America has increased, in large part because of the racial fears of white men who have bought guns in record numbers for 8 years during the time in office of America's first black president. A landmark 1999 study from researchers Franklin Zimmerman and Gordon Hawkins showed that the main correlation, far surpassing mental illness, socioeconomic status, or race, that could be defined as causal in predicting the rates of gun deaths is a simple number, the number of guns distributed among society. In the 30 years since that study, Zimmerman and Hawkins' results have been replicated and reanalyzed dozens of times. As the American Academy of Pediatrics said in a release published in AAAS's Science magazine, quote, new research shows dramatic differences in the number of children hospitalized and killed each year in the U.S. from firearm-related injuries based on their state's gun legislation, even after adjusting for poverty, unemployment, and education rates. It found twice as many pediatric firearm deaths in states with the most lenient gun regulations compared to states where gun laws are strictest, end quote. They added that this is a critical issue for children, quoting Stephanie Cho, MD, the lead author of the abstract, quote, firearm-related injuries are the second leading cause of death among children in the United States. But we found a clear discrepancy in where those deaths happen that corresponds with the strengths of states' firearm legislation. In states with lenient laws, children die at alarmingly greater rates, end quote. And unsurprisingly, America not only has unusually lenient gun laws, but also has more guns in civilian hands than any other country in the world. America has a bit more than 4% of the world's population, but holds almost 50% of all the guns in civilian hands worldwide, more than 390 million guns. And the more guns a society has, the more gun deaths it will experience. The NRA and their army of lobbyists have been quite successful in making this happen. During Obama's presidency, there was a steady and hysterical drumbeat of articles, emails, and political proclamations by so-called pro-gun politicians and think tanks, suggesting that Obama was preparing to take away everyone's guns at any minute. There was even a subtext embraced by the hard right that he wasn't going to stop there. After disarming white Americans, these folks said, Obama was going to intern them in otherwise unused FEMA camps. Flipped-out gun owners were repeatedly arrested during the Obama years trying to break into retired or temporarily vacant military facilities and toxic waste sites, looking for evidence to prove that Obama was, in fact, preparing the modern-day version of the World War II-era Japanese internment camps. White supremacy was the founding notion of this nation. White Europeans thought themselves so superior to the human beings they met here in 1492 that Columbus himself became the first North American slaver, shipping Taino Indians back to Spain as slaves to the royal family. A slave is as good as gold, Columbus wrote for the king and queen. Europeans in the Americas then stepped up that game into a hemisphere-wide campaign of racial genocide, pulling off the largest multi-generational mass murder in the history of the world. In the midst of that effort, they also created the legal mechanisms necessary to define and legally regulate slavery, and even built those systems into America's founding document, the Constitution. America was birthed in slavery and genocide, and both needed guns. It was the superior weaponry of guns that gave the European settlers a massive advantage over the bow and arrow-equipped Native Americans, and it was the raw power of widespread white ownership of guns in the South that propped up the institution of slavery for hundreds of years. Without guns, neither would concerts. It's enough to make one think that Isaiah was onto something. Chapter 2, The Sanitized History of America. The United States' expansion and conquest in the late 18th century through the 19th century and into the 20th century is a history written by white men, inked in the blood of Native Americans, and built on the broken and bloody backs of enslaved people brought here from Africa. From 1791, when the Bill of Rights went into effect, until the end of the Civil War, the Second Amendment protected the rights only of white men to own guns. This is simply because until the ratification of the 14th Amendment, states determined who was recognized as a person protected under the Constitution. Initially, in most states, that meant that white men who owned land and paid taxes were the only people considered full citizens under the Constitution. In the South, white men with guns formed slave patrols to control slaves and formed posses to hunt escaped slaves. The book, The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Pharma spent a small fortune last year, well, they do every year, buying politicians. And one of the things that they buy politicians to prevent is the possibility of you and I buying drugs from Canada at retail, filling prescriptions from Canada or other foreign countries. And the reason that they say that they don't want us to buy, that the politicians who take the money from Big Pharma say that they don't want us buying our drugs from Canada is because of safety, right? Canadian drugs are not as safe. Now, I lived near the Canadian border. I grew up in Michigan near the Canadian border, lived in Vermont for 10 years near the Canadian border, 2 hours away. And I don't recall any stories about Canadians dropping dead all over the place because their drug supply was contaminated. But we are seeing this now here in the United States. There's a compound called NDMA. It is one of the ingredients of rocket fuel. And in fact, it was first, the massive contamination of NDMA was discovered outside of west of Los Angeles in an area where they were actually manufacturing rockets. It gets into the water supply, and it's called what's highly miscible is the word, and it means highly, super soluble. You put a couple of drops of it into an aquifer, like, miles and miles of underground water, and within days, it has contaminated all of that water. And you say, how could a couple of drops contaminate all the water? Well, the U.S. Department of, is it the USDA or the FDA? The FDA says that the permissible, acceptable daily human intake is 96 nanograms. That's 0.000096 of 1 milligram. In other words, an amount that's just so insanely tiny. And so, anyhow, that's the 96 nanograms is the maximum that the FDA says we're allowed to take. Well, what they're finding now is some drugs that are manufactured in India using raw materials made in China that are sold in the United States as generics, and by the way, 80% of all drugs sold in the United States are generics, are contaminated by NDMA at levels up to 20 times that 96 microgram threshold. Now, why should we care about this? Well, it's one of the most potent carcinogens out there. It's insanely carcinogenic. Cancer researchers, talk about this. It's also extremely poisonous. A Chinese graduate student, medical student, put a few drops in his roommate's water. It killed him. He thought it would be a joke. A Canadian grad student did the same thing. He put some NDMA in a colleague's apple pie. It killed him. It is insanely poisonous. Now, so ever since 1987, when Congress and the Reagan administration cut a corrupt deal with Big Pharma to ban the import of retail pharmaceuticals in the United States, this dates back to Reagan. This is another thing that Reagan did, 1987. You may no longer fill your prescription with a Canadian pharmacy. That's when drug prices started exploding here in the United States because the pharmaceutical manufacturers have a captive audience. And they're saying those Canadian drugs are not safe, but we would be glad to sell you some contaminated drugs from India. I mean, first it was blood pressure medications. Then it was Zantac, proton pump inhibitor, this anti-upset stomach drug. And not just Zantac, I think I'm saying it right, but all of its generic versions. And now it's starting to look like, well, not starting to look like, now they've identified this in metformin. Metformin is a drug that doctors give to people who typically are overweight and are at risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And they also give it to people in the early stages of type 2 diabetes because it helps the body regulate blood sugar. It is the most widely prescribed drug in the world right now. And it's now also contaminated by NDMA because these pharmaceutical companies are bringing it in from China and India. Now, if you want the brand name version of any of these drugs, they are available. They're just much more expensive because they're manufactured in Switzerland or in Germany or in Ireland, which is where most brand name drugs are manufactured. Most of the generics are manufactured in India. So if we could just get rid of this 1987 law, this Reagan law, that said that it's illegal to import drugs from Canada, then Americans could buy Canadian brand name drugs manufactured in Germany or Switzerland or even in Canada, instead of buying generics here that are probably about the same price as the Canadian brand names. Or better alternative, you know, Democrats for years have been talking about bringing our jobs, our manufacturing jobs, back to the United States. Why don't we bring back our pharmaceutical manufacturing jobs? So there you go. My thoughts on that. Anyhow, a lot of other stuff in the news we'll get to as we continue here on the program. But Catherine in Burlington, Vermont. Hey, Catherine, what's on your mind?
Yes. Hi, Tom, and thank you. I go to a local grocery that's a co-op, and the other day I was asking them, what if somebody goes wild and starts stealing either money or food or what have you? What do you do about that? And they use managers at this co-op. They vote them in, and they vote them out.
You mean one of the employees, are you talking about? Starts
what if one of the
stealing
employees,
from the company?
yes, and they say, well, the manager of that employee or that area where the person stole from would deal with the incident and the surrounding environment of the incident. For example, if the person had been hungry and stole money, anyway, it would be dealt with. They wouldn't necessarily be fired.
Right. So
in a
what's your
system? You steal from anything, anywhere, whatever, you get fired.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, there's no shortage of stories, and I think a lot of parents couldn't even tell these stories, and certainly my parents could, of their kids getting caught, you know, stealing a candy bar from a store or something like that, and the owner of the store calls the parents instead of calling the police. I mean, that's less frequent now than it was 40 years ago.
Yes. But I'm talking about people working.
Right. Business is pretty unforgiving, and probably with a co-op, because of its more egalitarian structure, there would be more of a concern about, you know, why did this person do this? Where are they coming from? That sort of thing. I get it. So your call was basically a critique of raw capitalism.
Yes. You talked about socialism earlier. You were reading from Wolf's book.
Yeah.
And so I thought I'd call.
Yeah, well, that was a good one. It's a great observation. Catherine, thanks for sharing that story with us. Tom in Portland. Hey, Tom, thanks for listening to X-Ray FM. What's up?
Hi, thanks for picking up my call.
Sure.
So you've had a couple of good calls today about just like a little, broadly speaking, how to talk about socialism, because it's such an uphill climb. And a lot of times we get hit with these real mansplaining types. They've got a little bit of economics knowledge. And so here's what I find is a good way to go back at it. I say, I let the demand curve be my guide. I don't believe that a free market is possible if a person can't walk out of the market, simply window shop and choose to walk out. So if I need an EpiPen or I'll die, there's no free market. I'm a human being. I need water. You can't have a pure free market, you know, if after a hurricane and people need water.
Right, and this is the rationale for food stamps, basically.
Right.
Go ahead.
Just real quick, Tom, just broadly speaking. So what I tell people is identify things where the demand curve is not flexible. Okay. As an individual and as a society, what do we want as a baseline? No matter how poor you are, no matter who you are, what do you want? Well, you need electricity, you need water, you need heat, you need education, you need stitches to stop the bleeding, so you need health care. So all of these things are candidates for socialism. Don't be afraid of a slippery slope. It doesn't mean that we're at war with the concept of free markets. It's just that where a market cannot be free because the seller just has too much control if the product is an absolute necessity.
Right. You're describing things, Tom, that I refer to as natural monopolies.
Right. Yeah, and so the points that the guy made before about the trash and the tomato, all of these things are kind of go in line with what I'm saying, and I think you can sell it to people that way, and you start off at the individual level, and then you say, okay, as a community, what what do we need? Well, we need to be able to communicate. We need ports. We need roads and travel between us, and parks and public safety. And my tea is ready. Sorry, I came across the. So anyway, I'll leave the rest of the show to you.
Okay, Tom, that's a great observation. Thank you very much. And there was a fascinating article this morning. I'm trying to remember where I read it because I read like 5-6 newspapers before I go on the air. It was either The Guardian, The Washington Post, The New York Times, or the Financial Times. It was in one of the papers that I get or that I read. And although I read them all online, and it was a story about a tribe, a Native American tribe in Northern California, in Humboldt County, as I recall, that had. They made some money with a casino, and they used that money to electrify the casino and the surrounding areas, the tribal surrounding areas, the surrounding residential areas, using solar and wind power and batteries and stuff like that. And when PG&E shut down the power to the whole area because there was big winds and the possibility of fires, and they didn't want broken power lines to cause more fires in the area, this tribe, this tribe, and not just the casino, but the area around it, was still running just fine. And so they were taking in people from the local hospital. They were which had lost its power. They were taking in, basically local refugees. It's people from the community. It was a pretty remarkable story. And it points out, I think, what Tom was talking about, the importance of defining exactly where the commons begins and ends. And what are those natural monopolies? Mark in Las Vegas. Hey, Mark, what's on your mind?
Hi, yes. Let me take it off of speakerphone.
Yeah, I'll get back to you in just a second, Mark, on that. Paul in Glenside, Pennsylvania. Hey, Paul, what's up?
Happy New Year, Tom.
Thanks. Back at you, Paul.
In keeping with your review or reading from Dr. Wolf's book on socialism, I'd like to bring up something I think is very pertinent. It's the contributions of unions, organized labor, to socialism in the United States. 120 years ago, organized labor agitated for the 8-hour workday. It was 8 hours to sleep, for rest, 8 hours for yourself, and 8 hours for work. And that got us the weekend. It got us the 5-day work week. Well, that was 120 years ago. Obviously, our economy today is so much more productive. I think what we're really looking at is a 3-day work week. And if you look at, I think, Andrew Yang, the guy who's really been pushing the UBI, the Universal Basic Income, he bases it on the coming of automation. Now, automation's here to a degree, but it's going to be more pronounced as the next 5 to 10 years go by, with the artificial intelligence infiltrating areas that used to be thought beyond automation, like bookkeeping or even financial advice.
Right.
So I think that we're going to see unions build on huge successes for getting a better quality of life. And I don't mean people just literally stop working altogether. I'm talking about our forced participation in the formal economy of corporate America, where we simply must have a job so we have a paycheck so we can eat and have a roof over our heads. I think that the push for the $15 an hour pay, which is today, it's January 2nd, you see all kinds of stories in like 20 different states. Everyone's getting a raise here, there. And
it's going to stimulate the economy and help Trump, by the way. Sadly, all these Democratic states that raise the... I'm not saying they shouldn't have done it. It's just that's going to be the main effect. Anyhow, Paul, finish up.
The big push, I think, with organized labor is now going to build on the success of $15 an hour and go for the 3-day work week.
Yeah.
We don't need to work as much as we used to in the formal economy.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Happy New Year to everyone.
Thank you, and Happy New Year to you too, Paul. There was a fascinating article about this in the Financial Times over the weekend, actually. Serious people are starting to seriously discuss these things, which is a good thing.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We'll be right back with more of the news of the day and your calls right after this. And welcome back. Martina in Madison, Wisconsin. Hey, Martina, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Happy New Year.
Thank you. Happy New Year to you, too.
What I'm calling about is a group called QAnon. Are you familiar?
I am. These are the conspiracy theorists who think that Donald Trump is saving America from the deep state.
Exactly. And they have a Facebook page called Follow the White Rabbit.
Okay.
Have you checked it out?
I have not checked it out. No.
Oh, please do, because it's obviously international, because there are different languages, there are different, and the comments are in code, so you have to be a very member of their private club in order to be able to understand.
Yeah, these are the people who brought us the, invading the pizzeria in Washington, D.C., because Hillary Clinton was running a child sex ring from the basement, a pizzeria that doesn't have a basement, by the way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's them.
Guy walks in and shoots up the ceiling.
Sure.
No, he did. He actually did. He walked into the pizzeria and fired a rifle. I mean, that's what happens when people start taking this crap seriously.
Truly. But my brother, Sir Richard the Redneck, he's a devout follower of King Donald, has sent me a link to a DVD, a YouTube video called I forget what the name of it is, but it starts with From Darkness to Light. And behind light, they have an image of a soldier brandishing an AR-15. That's their version of light. Now, I think that was covered in Genesis 1:3, but then that's beside the point. There are some other quotes, just real brief ones that I want to give you. He talks about the corrupt and failed regime of the Obama administration. Then he says in one point, it's my turn to give back. I want to know what exactly has he given back. Everything he says applies better to his Republican administration than to Obama's, but it's one of the pre-election speeches against Hillary.
Yeah.
It's obvious that somebody else wrote it for him because it sounds so good.
You mean this is Trump?
And the commentary on it is so good.
Yeah. I get it, Martina. And these bizarre conspiracy theories can actually tear societies apart. It was a bizarre conspiracy theory in part that led the slaughter of the Tutsis or the Hutus in Rwanda. Good. I mean, and it was fed by talk radio, which is why we need to take this stuff seriously rather than just laughing at these people or thinking of them as rubes. But it is being weaponized now by social media, particularly Facebook, and and the internet. I mean, QAnon, I believe, started over at 4chan. But I don't know what to do about it other than just point out to people that they're being sucked into a scam, basically.
Yeah, I'll send you a couple links. We'll talk about it because I got a lot of ideas. Okay, bless you. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks, Martina. I mean, the whole idea that there are evil forces that are controlling everything we do and everything that happens is as old as humanity. Right? Whether it was the gods, whether it was demons, whether it was individual groups. In Hungary, Viktor Orban yells about Jews and gypsies, repeating basically the Hitler rhetoric. Create an other. Here in the United States, it's Donald Trump yelling about Muslims and dark-skinned people coming from south of our border. And, if you can create an other, you can use that as a political weapon. And we really need to be sensitive to that. We'll be right back. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. I guess yesterday was the day for New Year's resolutions, right? And I would just like to propose that people think about meatless Mondays. 14.5% of all climate change gases are caused by animal agriculture. And if we were to simply eat a purely plant-based diet 1 day a week, all of us, it would substantially help our planet. It would reduce a lot of suffering among fellow mammals and chickens and fish. And it would make us all healthier. And you'd probably lose a little weight. So think about Meatless Mondays. Yeah, Meatless Mondays is it's becoming a thing now. So, whether it means going to get an Impossible Burger at Burger King instead of a Whopper, or whether it means, there's ways to do this that are relatively painless. Anyhow, Mark in Las Vegas. Hey, Mark, what's on your mind today?
Hi, I apologize for being on speakerphone last time.
It's quite all right.
I really want to get to this point that I'm very tired of the infighting in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, welcome to the club.
Relitigating the 2016 election.
Mm-hmm.
Look, in the end, we're going to have two choices. You're either going to, by protest vote or other means, end up voting for Trump, who's insane and a sociopath, or you're going to vote for a Democratic candidate. This
Correct.
is what it comes down to. Every minute people waste fighting about who the nominee should be on the Democratic Party side is a waste of time.
Oh, I disagree with that, Mark. I think that it's really important that we have a discussion about the policy issues that each candidate is bringing to the table and which of those policy issues really should be made into law and which ones shouldn't.
And I do agree with it. I do agree with you there regarding policy. But identity politics needs to go away in some of those aspects. And remember, in the end,
well, you're not going to get rid of identity politics, Mark. You're always going to have women who correctly and rightfully feel like there has never been a woman president. They've never really been represented in that Article 2 branch of government. You're going to have African Americans and Hispanics and other people of color who have been the victims of a white power structure, a white supremacist power structure in this country for 240 some odd years, who will feel a little more comfortable with people who have shared their experience, and that's not an unreasonable thing. We can wish it away, but it's not going to go away.
No, I'm not trying to wish it away. What I'm saying is that don't let that be the excuse to not vote.
Oh, yeah, of course. I'm with you. Vote blue no matter who. I don't know if you've seen all these yard signs that are popping up. I'm seeing them all over the place that say, any responsible adult, any something adult. Yeah. Any sane adult. Thank you, Sean. That's great. Mark, thanks a lot for the call. I'm with you. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The hidden history of the Supreme Court and the betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. This is our book today is Playing with Fire, the 1968 Election and the Transformation of American Politics by Lawrence O'Donnell. The first chapter, Seizing the Moment, it starts in 1968. Richard Nixon was in a makeup chair when he met Roger Ailes. Maybe it was the makeup chair that set Ailes off. He was looking at the man who might have been president right now if he had just sat in the makeup chair CBS offered him in Chicago before the first televised presidential debate in American history. Nixon had ignored the network's makeup artist and used a drugstore product called Lazy Shave to cover his heavy 5 o'clock shadow. Nixon once said, "I can shave within 30 seconds before I go on television and still have a beard." The day after the debate, the Chicago Daily News ran the headline, "Was Nixon sabotaged by TV makeup artists?" Richard Daley, the all-powerful Democratic mayor of Chicago, said, "My God, they've embalmed him even before he died." Nixon lost the election to John F. Kennedy by 0.2% of the vote, 49.7% to 49.5%. In an election that close, every mistake matters. A mistake like not getting the makeup right was the kind of thing that infuriated Roger Ailes. Now, 7 years later, Ailes was meeting Nixon for the first time in the makeup room of the Mike Douglas show. At age 26, Ailes looked like an assistant, but he was the boss, the executive producer of the show, and Nixon was once again a presidential candidate in what was beginning to look like a crowded field covering the 1968 Republican nomination. Ailes wanted Nixon to be president, and he knew the most powerful force blocking Nixon's path to the White House was television. To win the White House in the 1960s, you had to understand and respect the power of television. Ailes also knew that one of Nixon's potential rivals for the Republican nomination understood everything about television, Ronald Reagan, the former film and TV actor. Ailes wondered what Nixon had learned about TV since the makeup disaster of the 1960 campaign. Sitting in the makeup chair, Nixon offhandedly mentioned to Ailes how silly it felt to try to reach voters by appearing on an afternoon talk show like this one instead of a news show like Meet the Press. The Mike Douglas show is targeted at housewives and usually populated by B-list showbiz celebrities. In response, Ailes instantly rattled off a list of every bad move Nixon had ever made on TV, and it was a long list. Ailes was a teenager when he'd seen some of these things. This was not the way people talked to former Vice President Richard Milhous Nixon. There was none of the deference Nixon had become accustomed to over the decades, and Nixon loved it. Nixon made Ailes an offer he couldn't refuse. Instead of trying to make Mike Douglas America's biggest afternoon TV star, make Richard Nixon America's next president. With Ailes on the media team, the Nixon campaign was ready to make the move from being the worst TV campaign to the best. "We're going to build this whole campaign around television," Nixon told his media team. "You boys just tell me what to do and I'll do it." Roger Ailes' career in Republican politics, which included every day he ran Fox News, turned out to be longer than Richard Nixon's. Ailes became more influential in Republican politics than Nixon ever was. We have reason to wonder who would be president today if Richard Nixon had not provoked Roger Ailes in the Mike Douglas show makeup room. Such are the seeds that were planted in American politics in the 1968 presidential campaign. Run, Bobby, Run is the subhead for the next part of this. Bobby was a natural on television. In 1967, he was the only potential presidential candidate who could charm a TV audience just by being himself. All he needed was his smile. Bobby was the Elvis of American politics, the only politician who didn't need a last name to identify him. But his last name was everything. It was Bobby Kennedy's last name that made every potential candidate fear him. As the field of candidates began to take shape in 1967, every campaign calculation depended on Bobby, even when he showed no signs of wanting to run, even when he told people he wasn't going to run. President Lyndon Baines Johnson feared Bobby to the point of obsession. Johnson thought Bobby was the only one who could do the unthinkable, challenge the incumbent president's grip on the Democratic nomination. Johnson was sure that Bobby was the only Democrat who might dare run against him. He was wrong. Nixon feared Bobby too, as did every Republican planning a campaign. Nixon knew exactly what to fear. He had lost to a Kennedy before. Losing to a Kennedy meant losing to the Kennedy political machine, and it meant losing it to the Kennedy style. A political machine can be beaten by a better political machine, though Nixon had never seen a better political machine than the Kennedys. Kennedy's style was something else. Nixon knew there was nothing Ailes could do for his image that could compete with Kennedy's style. Nixon couldn't change his sharply receding hairline. At 54, he was too old to do anything but tamp down his short, dark hair as flat as possible on his head. Bobby's hair had grown longer every year of the 1960s. Now at 42, he had the shaggiest hair in the United States Senate. His little brother Ted was the only other senator with a full head of hair. Bobby's hair was beginning to grow over his ears, rock musician length for the Senate then. And everywhere Bobby spoke outside the Senate chamber, he was treated like a rock star. That's what Nixon and Johnson feared most about Bobby, the way the crowds responded to him. They'd never seen anything like it in politics. Nixon and Johnson were both old enough to remember the first time anyone saw fans screaming and swooning for Frank Sinatra in the 1940s, before, during, and after every song Sinatra sang. America saw an even more intense version of that fan reaction when the Beatles landed in the United States in 1964. And now Nixon and Johnson saw a version of it happening to Bobby. Everywhere Bobby went, crowds worked themselves into frenzies. When he spoke, he didn't sound like any senator they'd heard before. His voice wasn't stiff and self-conscious. The book Playing with Fire by Lawrence O'Donnell.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. On the line with us is Congressman Alan Grayson, former U.S. Congressman from the 9th District of Florida, the author of a new book, High Crimes, The Impeachment of Donald Trump. His book is available, wherever books are available. And Congressman Grayson, welcome back to the program, first off.
Thanks. It's available at impeachbook.com. Thank you, Tom.
Impeachbook.com. Thank you very much.
Right.
So this whole impeachment process of Donald Trump, we've been kind of out of the loop for a week or so, and bring us up to date on exactly where it's at. I was hearing reports this morning, a few hours ago, before I went on the air, that some Republicans were suggesting that Mitch McConnell could go ahead and hold his trial without ever receiving the articles of impeachment from Nancy Pelosi. I don't know if that's a possibility. What's the current state of events?
The House has voted to impeach Donald Trump. They are going to put together a resolution that will identify the impeachment managers to run the impeachment of the Senate. And then the Senate will have a trial. That's where we are now. Anything else is fantasy.
Okay, great. So, obviously, you've got Mitch McConnell saying he doesn't want to have any witnesses. He's going to have a fast trial. Basically, the thing is rigged. You've got Lisa Murkowski saying, well, wait a minute. I might want to hear from a witness. And then, of course, Susan Collins playing both sides as she always does. I'm very concerned. Maybe we should have witnesses. Well, I don't think we need witnesses, whatever. Where's that? How does that play out?
Well, it plays out fundamentally differently from where people appear to think it plays out, and that includes the leadership of both parties. Basically, what happened in the House is a grand jury vote, as if it were in a criminal case. What happens in the Senate is a jury decision. When's the last time you saw a criminal trial, a jury trial? When is the last time you saw a jury trial without witnesses? It doesn't happen. That's not the way things work, especially in a criminal case or a quasi-criminal case.
Now, the Republicans are asserting that the Clinton impeachment trial did not have witnesses. Is that simply a lie, or go ahead?
That was by agreement of all 100 senators unanimously. You'd never have an agreement like that today. The normal procedure, if you look at it historically, which the book does, it looks at all of the impeachments in the federal system, all the impeachments of governors, and so on and so forth. If you look at it historically, what happens next is that after the impeachment manager is appointed, they call witnesses, just like a prosecutor would in a criminal case.
Right.
And then if there's an objection to that witness, then the Chief Justice will rule whether the witness's testimony would be relevant or irrelevant. And then any senator can appeal the ruling, and then there'll be some kind of vote on it if some senator appeals. But think about how that looks if the House impeachment managers call someone as a witness, and then the Chief Justice rules in their favor that the witness's testimony would be relevant, and then Mitch McConnell tries to stuff everybody on a 51 to 49 or 52 to 48 vote and try to cut that off. That clearly looks like obstruction of justice on Mitch McConnell's part.
Now, I would like to put the Clinton argument to bed, because I hear it repeated every day on Right Wing Talk Radio. The reason why all 100 senators agreed that there was no need to hear from any more witnesses in the Bill Clinton impeachment was because Bill Clinton himself had already testified. Many other people had come forward. Ken Starr had spent $74 million, if I'm remembering correctly, and 3 or 4 years investigating the Clintons for a whole variety of things that ended up with the Paula Jones trial that led to Monica Lewinsky and that led to his line about having consensual sex with another adult, outside of his marriage, which, happens. And I think everybody felt, and then Ken Starr came out with that pornographic report that was tens of thousands of pages long, or thousands of pages long, that we were just like drenched in testimony. And, I remember NPR reporting on it at the time, driving down the street listening to NPR, where the reporters were having to say, and please forgive us for using this word. And then they would, use the word penis or something like that. And, quoting Ken Starr. And it was such a challenge. I mean, that's the exact opposite of what is happening here, where there has been no grand jury, there has been no testimony by the president, there has been no testimony by any of the people close to him or anybody around him. There has been no special prosecutor, and the House of Representatives has been trying to do this by themselves, and they've been completely stonewalled. Do I have that right?
Yes, entirely right. And in Ken Starr's case, he accomplished something that people didn't even think was possible. He managed to make pornography boring.
Right.
But as to where we are right now, that's entirely correct. What ought to happen is the House managers ought to call a certain number of witnesses to prove their case, just as you would a criminal trial. And I think they ought to call Donald Trump. I think they should call Donald Trump as a witness, and if he wants to plead the fifth, that is fine with me.
Now, I'm watching Joe Biden do a delicate dance with this, and I can just imagine either his internal dialogue or his, consultants or handlers or whatever the appropriate word is for somebody running for president, talking with him. Trump says, "I want Joe Biden to testify," and Joe immediately is like, "Wait a minute, you're trying to make this trial about me?" Well, of course, the whole thing has been about him. It's really about Trump, obviously, but it's about Trump's attempts to smear Joe Biden in advance of the election. And so he's thinking, well, harump, I'm not going to play into that. And then the Republicans start saying, well, Joe Biden says he doesn't have to testify. If he doesn't have to testify, then why should Mick Mulvaney have to testify? And at which point Joe Biden starts saying, well, maybe I would testify if I was subpoenaed. In other words, I would honor a subpoena. This has got to be a really, really tricky one. And I would think if Joe Biden testified, if it's true, and I'm perfectly willing to believe that it is, in fact, I fully believe that it is, that he not only had nothing to do with his son getting that job, but probably knew nothing about it until well after the fact, because he had put this firewall between himself and his kids, which I think was a mistake, but nonetheless. Then probably his testimony would actually be a good thing for Joe Biden. But anyhow, what are your thoughts on both the legalism of this as an attorney and an author, and the politics of this as a former member of Congress?
Well, he clearly made the wrong decision here. First of all, it's not voluntary. What would happen in reality is that President Trump's attorneys, he's entitled to representation at the Senate hearing. His attorneys would call Joe Biden as a witness. And then the Chief Justice would make a ruling one way or another, whether Biden's testimony is relevant or not. Probably would rule that it's irrelevant, but you can't be sure of that. Okay. And then one senator would be able to appeal that ruling, and then there'd be a vote on it as to whether Joe Biden would be required to testify. And if the vote is against Biden, he would have to testify whether he likes it or not. There's a police force that exists for the Senate, that exists for the purpose, among other things, of making sure that people who are called to testify with the Senate actually do testify before the Senate. So what he should have done, Tom, what he should have done is said, I'll testify if Donald Trump will testify.
Right.
And that would have been the end of it.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. Good point. So what do you expect to be happening over the next week or two here? I know that there's a court case, I believe it's going to be decided tomorrow, about whether Don McGahn should testify. That's testified to the House, as I recall. Where is all this going? Or was that in a lawsuit?
Well, the House can continue with this impeachment proceeding and also with other impeachment proceedings. By goodness, I mean, Donald Trump is a walking, talking impeachable offense.
Right.
And he's guilty of so many other forms of abuse of power, so many other forms of obstruction of justice. He's guilty of tax evasion. He's guilty of sexual crimes. He's guilty of this, that, and the other thing. The book demonstrates that of the 9 different things that people have been impeached for in the past, Donald Trump is guilty of all of them. It's a remarkable accomplishment for any human being. But to answer your question, the House can continue to collect information on this impeachment proceeding and on other impeachment proceedings, and I think that they should do that. For instance, everybody knows he's been cheating on his taxes. The New York Times wrote a 15,000-word article on it one week to document it all. And of course, he's gone out of his way to prevent any release of his tax information, both before, during, and after the campaign. So what they ought to do is get the appropriate documentation and set that in motion as well. People don't realize this, but one of the impeachment provisions against Nixon, which they decided not to proceed with, but they actually had written it up and introduced it, was to show that Nixon had underpaid his taxes by $400,000. Well, Donald Trump has probably underpaid his taxes by $400 million.
Yeah, and in the case of Nixon,
it's an impeachable offense for Nixon. It's an impeachable offense for Trump as well.
Yeah, amen. And in the case of Nixon, as I recall, it was because Nixon failed to report a bribe he took. It's like
Agnew failed to report a bribe he took.
Oh, right? That was the one? Okay. Remarkable stuff. The book is called High Crimes, The Impeachment of Donald Trump. It's available on impeachmentbook.com.
No, impeachbook.com.
Impeachbook. Thank you, sir.
Impeachbook.com.
Thank you, sir. Yes. We will get that written down for future references. And you can also tweet Congressman Grayson at Alan, A-L-A-N, Grayson. Congressman, thanks a lot for dropping by. Always great talking with you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll be right back with more of the news of the day and your calls right after this.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
16 minutes past the hour of the Thom Hartmann Program. Fair and only slightly unbalanced. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Rob in Waconia, Minnesota. Hey, Rob, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I wanted to call and talk to you about the Social Security disability story that you were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering, does this refer to Trump's plan to add an additional review category to the continuing disability reviews process that they have?
I'm not sure. The article that I have is not technical. It's basically, designed for just simple news reporting, and it simply says that, and I'd have to dig it out of the trash here right now, but my recollection is that it simply says that rather than, I believe, and if you're on SSI or SSDI, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Rob, but I believe that right now you go through that 2-year process to qualify, and once you're qualified, you get the benefits. Particularly if you have a disability that is considered permanent. If it's not considered permanent, you may be periodically contacted and asked to reaffirm your disability. But this would codify that every 6 months you have to basically reapply for your benefits, or reassert your need for those benefits.
Right. I am on SSDI. I suffer from bipolar disorder. And I tweeted you 2 articles, one from Snopes and another one from Common Dreams.
Okay.
That has a comment from Alex Lawson, someone you have on the program fairly often.
Right.
And this was something that they introduced back in November. There are basically 3 different categories that people are put into after they're approved for Social Security disability. Medical improvement expected, and they get a review every 6 to 18 months. Medical improvement possible, they get a review every 3 years, and then medical improvement not expected, and that review is every 5 to 7 years.
So those are the current. That's the current situation.
Those are the current ones.
Right.
And what Trump is talking about doing is adding an additional category called medical improvement expected.
Mm-hmm.
And basically what it would do is add another category where they could check up on you, which basically means that you have to go and see your doctor and have them fill out a form and then send it back to the Social Security Disability Administration and have them process it to say, yes, I'm still sick and disabled.
Thanks for that explanation, Rob. I've never had to deal with this particular bureaucracy, and it's fascinating to understand it. So it seems to me that the logical result of that would be that if the push was to have fewer people getting Social Security disability benefits, it would also be to move more people into that new, more restrictive category. Does that comport with your understanding?
Well, I think what there will be is there will be a pressure put on doctors to try and put them into this new category so that they can, check up on you more often.
Oh, then the doctor gets to charge you for a visit every 6 months instead of every year or two.
Exactly.
Right, exactly. So everybody wins. The downside, though, is that the Social Security Administration has been so gutted of personnel. I don't know how they're going to handle, having to do every 6 months on a more frequent basis. Right. And then more people are going to fall through the cracks, right, Rob?
Yeah, and that's exactly what the Snopes article and the Common Dreams article is saying. They agree with you entirely that people will die from this.
That's terrible. Rob, I'll go check out my Twitter feed during the next break. Thanks so much for sending me that information. Thanks for calling.
Yep.
Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Videos, check it out. Tag, you're it. Thom Hartmann here with you. What do Republicans and Democrats do when they gain complete power over a state? This is like a really interesting question. It's absolutely fascinating. In other words, don't listen to what they say. What do they do? Perry Bacon Jr. Wrote a great piece for 538.com just documenting this. There are 14 states that are totally controlled by Democrats. The Democrats control the governor's office. They control the senior administrative offices. They control the House of Representatives, or the Assembly, as it may be called, or the whatever the lower chamber is called, and they control the Senate, which is typically what the upper chamber is called. And I think we've got one, maybe two states that have a unicameral legislature. That's if that was the case, so anyhow, 14 states that are completely controlled by Democrats, 22 states that are completely controlled by Republicans. So what do they do differently? In the democratically controlled states, and this is just looking at the last 4 years, at the democratically controlled states, since 2010, this would be this is the last decade, basically. In the democratic controlled states, there has, every single one of them has passed a law to hike the minimum wage, significantly above $7.25 an hour, some of them, quite substantially. Every single one of those 14 states has passed a law banning so-called conversion therapy that, basically led to a lot of suicides and a lot of just terrible, terrible outcomes. This was the so-called therapy where you could convert a person from being gay to being straight by harassing them, humiliating them, playing shrink with them, praying with them, which is what the Congresswoman from Minnesota, Michelle Bachmann, her husband, did for a living. All of these states have banned this, have outlawed it, because it's so destructive and it actually destroyed lives. All of these states have joined the interstate compact that when you have enough states who represent 274 or whatever the magic number is of electoral votes, then the Electoral College basically goes away. Whoever wins the majority of the votes across the United States wins the presidency. In other words, George W. Bush and Donald Trump never would have been president if this had happened. All of these states have joined this. This is at fairvote.org. You can find all the information on that. So what did the Republican-controlled states do? You've got 22 states that are entirely controlled by Republicans, and every single one of them have passed laws to do the following. Eliminate restrictions on gun rights. They have made it made it easier to get or sell or buy guns. Every single one of these 22 states have passed laws banning cities from being so-called sanctuary cities. And in a few places, you've got cities that are really fighting back on this, saying, hey, what about states' rights, essentially? What about local rights? What about democracy, small d democracy? Our people want this. And then all of them have passed legislation that would weaken the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement, the BDS movement, which is an effort by typically people on the left, but not entirely, to hold Israel accountable for the apartheid regime that they're running in largely in Israel proper, but in particular in Gaza. And basically the way that the Israeli government is treating Palestinians, and the BDS movement. In some states, if you have signed up for it or endorsed it or whatever, some of these new Republican-controlled states, no college for you or whatever it may be. I mean, there's some pretty strong restrictions or attempted restrictions on what I would say is free speech. So, there's a whole lot of other things that have happened in some of those states. But basically what you see are that the Democratic-controlled states, the states controlled by people entirely within the Democratic Party, are moving toward a better quality of life for their workers and, a more humane way of life for all their people. And the Republican-controlled states, generally trying to restrict abortions, make it easier to get guns, stop sanctuary cities, and they're all down with stopping the BDS movement. Fascinating stuff. Anyhow, it's coming up on 28 minutes past the hour. We'll pick up your phone calls after the break here. Thanks so much for being with us. The Thom Hartmann Program, the place where despair is not an option.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Occupying the media 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, right here. We'll be right back. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is The Entrepreneurial State by Mariana Mazzucato. And this is from the introduction titled Thinking Big Again. Across the globe, countries, including in the developing world, look to emulate the success of the U.S. economy. In doing so, they look at the power of, quote, market-driven, end quote, mechanisms versus what might seem like old-style state-driven mechanisms in places like Europe or the ex-Soviet Union. But the United States is not what it seems. The preacher of the small state free market doctrine has for decades been directing large public investment programs in technology and innovation that underlie its past and current economic success. From the internet to biotech and even shale gas, the U.S. state has been the key driver of innovation-led growth, willing to invest in the most uncertain phase in the innovation cycle and let business hop on for the easier ride down the way. If the rest of the world wants to emulate the U.S. model, they should do as the United States actually did, not as it says it did. More state, not less. A key part of this lesson should be to learn how to organize, direct, and evaluate state investments so that they can be strategic, flexible, and mission-oriented. Only in this way will top minds find it an honor to work for the state. This is something that needs to be understood not only by the rest of the world, but in the United States itself, where the dominant political narrative is endangering funding for future innovation and economic growth. In 2013, U.S. government spending for basic research fell below what it was a decade earlier, and most likely will continue to fall due to congressional gridlock over the public budget. Rather than static discussions about the size of the deficit, there must be more debate about its actual composition, how to invest strategically in key areas such as research and development, R&D, education, and human capital formation that will increase gross domestic product, the GDP, in the future, bringing the debt-GDP ratio down as a consequence. And how to engage in a debate about the direction of change so that such investments will lead to growth that is not only smarter, that is innovation-led, but also more inclusive and sustainable. These issues are urgent with the upcoming 2016 U.S. presidential election, which could, if properly informed, change the parameters of the current static debate. The United States desperately needs politicians with the courage to swim against the tide of popular rhetoric and outline a bolder vision for the state's dynamic role in fostering the economic growth of the future. In emerging economies such as China, the public sector is indeed investing billions in green technologies with the expectation that these industries will be the engines of future growth. The United States could take inspiration from its own history. In 1961, an American president set out a bold, ambitious, and risky mission to send a man to the moon. Who will have the courage to set out a new vision for America today? Addressing today's societal challenges, for example, those around climate change, requires a vision, a mission, and most of all, confidence about the state's role in the economy. As eloquently argued by Keynes in The End of Laissez-Faire in 1926, the important thing for government is not to do things which individuals are doing already and to do them a little better or a little worse, but to do those things which at present are not done at all. End of quote. This, however, requires the public sector to have vision and confidence, increasingly missing today. Why? What is the role of the public sector in economic growth? After the financial crisis, with public budgets bloated, mainly due to their role in saving the private sector, across the globe we are hearing that in order for nations to be competitive, innovative, and dynamic, we must have more market and less state. As at best, we are told, governments merely facilitate the economic dynamism of the private sector. At worst, their lumbering, heavy-handed, and bureaucratic institutions actively inhibit it. The fast-moving, risk-loving, and pioneering private sector, by contrast, is what really drives the type of innovation that creates economic growth. According to this view, the secret behind an engine of innovation like Silicon Valley lies in its entrepreneurs and venture capitalists. The state can intervene in the economy, but only to fix market failures or to level the playing field. It can regulate the private sector in order to account for the external costs companies may impose on the public, like pollution, and it can invest in public goods, such as basic scientific research or the development of drugs with little market potential. To some on the political right, even fixing market failures would be a sin, because such attempts would lead to worse outcomes in the form of government failures. What all these views have in common is the assumption that the state should stick to fixing markets, not directly trying to create and shape them. A 2012 Economist article on the future of manufacturing encapsulates this common misperception. This book is committed to dismantling this false image, which underpins a global trend promoted by conservative economists, politicians, and the media of bashing and diminishing the importance of the state. It focuses on what Tony Judt called a discursive battle. How we talk about the state matters. Depicting private business as the innovative force while the state is cast as the inertial one, necessary for the basics but too large and heavy to be the dynamic engine, is a description that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we continue to depict the state, continues. So the book is The Entrepreneurial State by Mariana Mazzucato.
Want Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Boy, we've covered a lot of stuff today. By the way, just a couple of quickies. The governor of Illinois, Governor J.B. Pritzker, new Democratic governor. Illinois today, or yesterday, I guess, was the day that Illinois legalized pot for recreational use. And he pardoned 11,017 people in the state of Illinois who had been convicted of marijuana offenses in the past. Which means now that they're pardoned, that they, get back basically all the rights that they might have lost as a consequence of having been convicted felons. I think that's pretty amazing, number one. And number two, Julian Castro, who I thought was a really good candidate, a really smart guy, and I have a lot of respect for. Not my favorite candidate, but I think he's a good guy, and he would have made a hell of a good president. Has dropped out of the race. He's just apparently not pulling the poll numbers and the fundraising. And so the field is continuing to narrow. And, the fundraising numbers are out now, and it looks like Bernie just knocked it out of the park. And haven't seen Elizabeth Warren's numbers yet. I don't know if they've come up while I've been on the air. But it's pretty interesting what's going on. So, anyhow, Walter in Northridge, California. Hey, Walter, what's on your mind today?
Well, I want to be very thankful for your staff and you and all the good work that you do, and wish all in your organization and the listeners a wonderful new year. It occurred to me that I frequently hear questions asked about how can this corrupt press be corralled, and just like the Federalists have chosen to nominate people or support people who would make King George proud of them to sit on his bench, King George III, to sit on his bench. It seems to me that fraud is a document that comes from my earlier work. I'm not an attorney, but fraud, as I understood it, and I had considerable success changing civil service rules in L.A. County based on fraud, is the misrepresentation of relevant fact or facts upon which a person or people rely to their detriment. It seems to me that there ought to be, you just had this wonderful attorney on, that the attorneys ought to get together and start to pursue, it seems to me, cases that charge Fox, for example, and stations that allow, either intentionally or not, if they know it's a lie, that's actual fraud, as I understand it. If they don't know it's a lie, it's constructive fraud. Both of them are illegal. And clearly the people are disadvantaged. There is a loss. And it seems to me that that might be a good way for people of goodwill to join together and follow the example of the, pardon the expression, sleazy Republicans who do all of this in order to increase profit, to increase personal participation in government, because it is fraudulent at its core, I believe.
Yeah, well, it's a well-articulated position, Walter, and I particularly liked your definition of fraud because it's just super clean.
Legal.
But here's the thing. I don't recall if it was the New York Times v. Sullivan case or another, but the Supreme Court, in numerous rulings over the years, over the centuries, in fact, has held that of all circumstances in which the First Amendment, the right to free speech, applies, the greatest area where the courts have to grant deference to speakers is politics. That is the one area where it is entirely impermissible and inappropriate for the courts to intervene. You could, Donald Trump could run an ad saying, send your $25,000 to Trump University and we guarantee you'll get a degree and you'll get a job, which he did. I don't know if it was 25 grand, but basically that was his fraud. And he was prosecuted for that. And he had to pay a $25 million fine. He was successfully prosecuted. But for Donald Trump to say, elect me president and I will bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States, Well, in fact, today I got an email from him saying he's brought 10,000 factories back. And you go and you look at the fact-checking site on the New York Times, and they're like, yes, 10,000 companies since Trump became president have registered themselves as manufacturing companies. 9,000 of them have 0 to 5 employees. It's not like, factories are being built, right? So, but you can't charge a politician with fraud. Yeah, you just can't.
Well,
because
kind sir, that might be true. That Mr. Hartmann, there was a case in the South where they used bad terms regarding black people and so forth, and it was forced to run as well. But Hannity, people who interview and allow lies to go forward or repeat them, are different than these sleazy politicians who may have additional rights because of the role that they
but because of the First Amendment, the only way that you could regulate speech in the media, and this went away in 1987, the only way you could regulate speech in the media was to require media to carry programming that is in the public interest. That was the explicit phrase from the Telecommunications Act, but you couldn't regulate beyond that because of the Supreme Court saying that again. Whether it's over the media or whether it's standing on a street corner with a bullhorn, you can't regulate political speech. Walter, I get your point. I think it's brilliant.
Yes,
I love it, but it ain't going to happen.
Well, thank you again for all that you do, and the best of the new year to all the decent people there.
Thank you. Back at you, Walter. Nice to hear from you. Thank you. DeCarlo in Lafayette, Indiana. Hey, DeCarlo, what's up? It says here you disagree with me about something. What did I miss?
Well, I was just, I guess it's more of a correction point because of something that you were bringing up in one of your analogies. You were bringing up the point of the Tutsis and the Hutus, and you were saying, "Oh, yeah, it was horrible because it was started on the radio by the Hutus to go against the Tutsis." But the thing is, this is real African history. The real African history behind it was the Europeans had come in, sided with the Tutsis to discriminate against the Hutus.
Right.
So what they did was they made sure that those Hutus could not get good jobs that could support their families. They could go into certain areas. If their color, if they were too dark, they were stopped. If their noses were too broad, they were stopped and weren't able to go into places. They actually were able to measure these people's noses. This is what the Tutsis did to the Hutus.
Whoa.
So then when the Europeans leave, well, then guess what? Hey, okay, this is how you've treated us for decades.
Right.
That was the recompense, or I guess the
retribution or retaliation. Thank you, DeCarlo, for that.
Wait, and I wanted to.
Go ahead.
And my thing with that was with the Hillary Clinton situation. I was going to ask. I don't understand why everyone continues to say that Hillary Clinton is over here and was such a good candidate when she didn't really do, what she did with the DNC and actually usurped democracy. I mean, I'm a Democrat myself. I used to, I stand by it, but I just didn't understand that.
Yeah, well, and Donna Brazile wrote a whole chapter in her autobiography apologizing to Bernie Sanders for what happened when she was the head of the DNC. I really think that we need to put 2016 behind us, though. I really do. Hillary Clinton is not on the ballot this year. I realize Bernie Sanders is, and there are still a number of people who were Hillary supporters who are unhappy with him because he had the temerity to challenge her in 2016. They're going to have to get over it, or they won't. I can't say they're going to have to get over it, but
I agree with you, Tom.
But we need to stop trying to relitigate 2016. And Robbie kind of kicked it off early in the show by saying, the Democratic primary was rigged. Yeah, there were some problems with the Democratic primary. That's not today. So we just need to move forward. DeCarlo, thanks a lot for the call. Norma in Montgomery, Alabama. Hey, Norma, what's up?
Hi, Tom.
Hey.
I originally called, because you were talking about what the TVs can say and not say, what the broadcasters can say.
Right.
And a lot of people don't know that they got so mad at, people got so mad at Rachel Maddow for talking bad or talking down to Senator Sanders that there is a new Facebook page to boycott MSNBC. There is also anger against CNN.
When did this happen?
About 2 weeks ago.
Oh, wow. I completely missed it. She had Bernie on her show and she treated him poorly?
Well, it's the way she talks about him and talks to him.
Oh.
And when he's not on the show, she's also dismissive.
Yeah.
And
well, she's not unique in that. I mean, she's not unique in that. You see that right across that network.
Yes, and so this has angered people.
Yeah.
And CNN has also said some disparaging things, and so now there is a boycott anything advertised on CNN and MSNBC. That's the only way is to vote against the networks is with your money.
Yeah.
But when it comes to Fox, most people don't understand that Fox Corporation is still registered in Australia. And so we have a foreign country, a foreign corporation dictating what people think here in the United States and disrupting our citizens, the culture of the United States. And nobody bothers to think anything about the way it is affecting our culture.
So News Corp.
They think it's wonderful and entertaining, but you have these foreigners who live in Australia, the 4 sons of Murdoch, the older 4, the younger 2 from a different marriage, I don't think are involved with the corporation. I'm not sure. But they are essentially running Fox News and dictating to the American public what we're supposed to think. And this is a bit much, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And this has we have more crime, we have hate. And this is because of Fox and what Trump has said. And if people don't understand this, they need to step back and think about how it has disrupted our culture, our economy, and how it affects people's ability to get jobs because, we don't hire those. We don't want those here. Right. Food rotted in the fields last summer because there weren't enough migrant workers. Nobody stops and think about who picks the lettuce, and it's a very nasty, dirty, hot job.
Right, and Trump,
you have to keep up with the machines, and you move faster, you get fired.
I get it, and in fact, Trump didn't fire his quote illegal immigrants. His undocumented.
I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Trump didn't fire his undocumented immigrants until after the picking season was over. He just fired some people from his Trump winery in Virginia. Can you hear me now, Norma?
Yes, I can, sir.
Okay.
This is a hypocrite.
Yeah, it definitely is. But your story about Fox News, over the weekend, Louise and I went to see, actually, I guess it was the day before yesterday, we went to see, is it Bombshell? Bombshell is the name of the movie. It's a new movie about, it's actually Gretchen Carlson's story. I was on Fox and Friends, and I met Gretchen Carlson, and she struck me as the only intelligent person on that set, between her and Steve Doocy and the other guy's name. And it's an amazing movie, Norma, if you want to talk about Fox News. And I would also refer you to the op-ed piece that former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd wrote for the Sydney Morning Herald. It's easily searched for. It's titled Rupert Murdoch is the cancer at the core of Australian democracy. And he talks about how Murdoch did this to Australia, then he moved to the UK and did it to the UK, and then he moved to the United States, and he's now doing it to the United States. And it's a pretty grim read. So. And
why did he get citizenship in one day?
Yeah, I didn't know it was one day, but yeah, that's a good question, too. Norma, thank you very much for the call. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
46 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here, the place where despair is not an option. And welcome back. Corky in Rochester, New York. Hey, Corky, thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's on your mind today?
Yeah, hello, Tom. I know how to get Democrat elected.
How?
You just keep embarrassing Trump every time you go on debate with him. You just embarrass him. He cannot handle criticism or embarrassment.
Right, and that's why I predict that he will not debate the Democratic nominee this year.
I agree with you. He's going to run like a chicken.
Yeah, there you go. Well said, Corky. Thank you very much for the call. John in McKees Rocks, Pennsylvania. Hey, John, what's on your mind today?
Tom, I wanted to touch on just to make a comment on something for Professor Wolf when you had him on. I didn't mention. He, was talking about all this money that the Fed's pouring in right now. If you're look up the definition of what causes hyperinflation, it's exactly what the Fed's doing now through the retail market.
No, not really.
Well, actually, if you look up
there are two ways that you can produce hyperinflation. The first, or any kind of inflation for that matter. The first is to debase the currency, which is what you're talking about, and we'll get to that in just a second. The second, and the one that is actually the most commonly, done, is to have an essential commodity for the operation of the nation to become scarce. And that's, for example, the commodity was food in Zimbabwe. When Mugabe took all the white farmers and basically kicked them off the farms and put local people in charge of those farms, many of whom had never run a farm before, food production in Zimbabwe, and this has nothing to do with race, it has to do with who knew what they were doing. Food production in Zimbabwe collapsed. I mean, their food levels just, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was like massive to the point of almost famine. The result of that was that the price of food exploded. And along with it, everything else did, and that crashed the currency. That was your hyperinflation. In the United States in the 1960s, and it wasn't just the U.S., this happened all across Europe as well, because our economy was so dependent upon oil, when the Arabs, twice in a 3-year period, cut off our supply of oil, the price of oil doubled, tripled, quadrupled, over a relatively short period of time, over about a year. And the consequence of that was inflation. And that's why you had 18% interest rates during the Jimmy Carter administration. That's typically how inflation happens. That's also what happened in Germany after World War II. The story that I had always heard when I was young was that Germany had intentionally debased their currency so they could pay off the Treaty of Versailles debts with a debased currency. But in fact, it was that their economy was so devastated by World War I that in addition to reparations, the price of everything was just exploding, and thus the value of the currency came down. Now, in an economy where you have hundreds of trillions of dollars in circulation around the world, our currency is the reserve currency for the planet. Dropping an additional $4 trillion, which is what the Fed has on their balance sheets right now, $4.16 trillion, dropping an additional $4 trillion into the U.S. domestic economy, and thus the worldwide economy, is relatively meaningless. It's not going to produce hyperinflation, John.
Well, I feel that's the end game, because I don't know if you're aware of something, but the Fed actually has a seat on Wall Street. They buy up stocks, repo market where banks are exchanging money all the time, overnight, and all quantitative easing.
They principally have that because anybody who wants to buy bonds has to buy them, which are sold by the Treasury, has to buy them through banks. And yeah, they're intervening in markets. This is the plunge protection plan. I got it, John. Thanks. Welcome back. Marta in New Orleans. Hey, Marta, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I was wanting to talk about the Social Security disability situation.
Mm-hmm.
I was caught up in a bad situation with the charge having to do with coming back home from Georgia to Louisiana, and I got a charge of entering into a domicile uninvited, and it's a charge on the books. It's an illegal entry into an inhabited residency.
Marta, what's your point?
The point is it's got a commitment charge to a mental health competency.
Right,
here.
Marta, I'm very sorry. I can't go down that road with you. George in Portland, Oregon. Hey, George, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom. Hey, I was wondering if there was any reason why you couldn't have Bernie Sanders on the show every week like you do with Ro Khanna.
I would be glad to have Bernie on every week. In fact, I'd be glad to have any of the presidential candidates on every week. They all know that they have an open door. And, Bernie's been coming on about once a month, and I'm expecting that he'll be coming on again soon. In fact, I got a text message this morning from the guy running his campaign asking if we were live this week. So I'm guessing that probably tomorrow he's going to show up, but that's just a guess. But we're certainly not keeping anybody off the show, George, at all. Rose in Chicago. Hey, Rose, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Yeah, I'm in Chicago, in Illinois, where we now have the legalized recreational pot that you were talking about.
I got to tell you, Rose, indicas are the best sleeping pills ever made. And I'll just leave it at that.
I believe that. Okay. Yeah, I briefly wanted to talk about all these lifetime appointment federal judgeships that are kind of going under the radar.
Mm-hmm.
They're being confirmed by the Senate, but there's so much other chaos going on in the news that the news media is talking about, the latest shiny object, that nobody's talking about these, and it's just so frightening. So, in my opinion, winning back the Senate, which could prevent this, is almost more important than who's in the White House to me. And why don't the millionaires and billionaires like Tom, what's his name? Steyer and Bloomberg, why don't they, instead of running for president, put their money toward the Senate races? It's just crazy.
I agree with you, Rose. I absolutely agree with you. And frankly, I wrote an op-ed about 6 months ago specifically to Tom Steyer, kind of an open letter to him saying, if you really want to have an impact on American politics that'll last even beyond your own lifetime, buy a radio network. At that time, Clear Channel was up for sale, or what's called iHeartRadio, and they were coming out of bankruptcy.
Great.
But, he didn't do it.
Is there any way to get rid of them? Can they be recalled?
Who's the they you're talking about?
Like the judges?
Trump's judges. They would have to be impeached one at a time, and you'd have to have a really, really good reason. And I think only one, actually there have been a couple of federal judges that have been impeached over the years. Only one Supreme Court justice had an impeachment brought against him, and that was back in the Revolutionary era. So it's pretty unlikely. I mean, once they're in, unfortunately. Rose, thanks a lot for the call. It's great to hear from you. I appreciate it. Carl in Columbus, Ohio. Hey, Carl, what's up?
Yeah, hi, Tom. The topics have shifted since I first called in.
That's okay.
As part of the White Castle forums here in Columbus, Ohio, a bunch of old men have spent years working out solutions to problems in the country.
Mm-hmm.
If you allow it sometime, I can give you pretty good outlines of some of the solutions to the problems.
Pick one right now, Carl, and share it with us if you can do it in 60 seconds or less.
Let's look at the model for taxation.
Mm-hmm.
That is one of the roots of our problem, not getting proper funding for government programs. And what I propose is the food truck model. A food truck does not have any bricks and mortar, doesn't own any real estate. It depends on infrastructure, police to keep the roads clear, to chase away thieves. Depends on emergency squads if somebody gets poisoned, whatever.
Right.
So the point is that the food truck utilizes the infrastructure and can be based outside the city and say, or even the state, and say, oh, that's not my problem.
So how do you capture that? How do you tax a food truck?
The way you do it is to treat it like a food truck and say, if you want to sell in our marketplace, you must buy a license. And that license can be in the form of taxation.
Right, or the license fee could be equivalent to what the tax might be. Carl, thanks a lot for the call. And apply that to our tech companies. I think that there's probably a more granular way to do it that is more, that more resembles taxation. But anyhow, thanks so much for being with us today. Boy, this day just flew right by. It's so great to be back on the air here with you live. We will be back tomorrow, same time, same place. It'll be Anything Goes Friday, although, you never know what pops up. And in the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires you. So please, get out there, get active, tag You're It, and share Progressive Media with your friends.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.